Preface. Taking knowledge less seriously. This book is the synthesis of, on one hand, the no-nonsense practitioner of uncertainty who spent his professional life trying to resist being fooled by randomness and trick the emotions associated with probabilistic outcomes, and on the other, the aesthetically obsessed, literature-loving human being willing to be fooled by any form of nonsense that is polished, refined, original, and tasteful. I am not capable of avoiding being the fool of randomness. What I can do is confine it to where it brings some aesthetic gratification. This comes straight from the gut. It is a personal essay primarily discussing its author's thoughts, struggles, and observations connected to the practice of risk-taking. Not exactly a treatise, and certainly, God forbid, not a piece of scientific reporting. It was written for fun, and it aims to be read, principally, for and with pleasure. Much has been written about our biases, acquired or genetic, in dealing with randomness over the past decade. The rules, while writing the first edition of this book, had been to avoid discussing A. anything I did not either personally witness on the topic or develop independently, and B. anything that I have not distilled well enough to be able to write on the subject with only the slightest effort. Everything that remotely felt like work was out. I had to purge from the text passages that seemed to come from a trip to the library, including the scientific name-dropping. I tried to use no quote that did not naturally spring from my memory. I did not come from a writer whom I had intimately frequented over the years. I detest the practice of random use of borrowed wisdom. Much on that later. As the saying goes, only when the words outperform silence. These rules remain intact, but sometimes life requires compromises. Under pressure from friends and readers, I have added to the present edition a series of non-intrusive endnotes referring to the related literature. I have also added new material to most chapters, most notably in Chapter 11, which altogether has resulted in an expansion of the book by more than a third. Adding to the winner. I hope to make this book organic, by, to use trader's lingo, adding to the winner, and let it reflect my personal evolution, instead of holding on to these new ideas and putting them into a new book altogether. Strangely, I gave considerably more thought to some sections of this book after the publication than I had before, particularly in two separate areas. A. The mechanisms by which our brain sees the world as far less random than it actually is, and B. The fat tails, that wild brand of uncertainty that causes large deviations. Rare events explain more and more of the world we live in, but at the same time remain as counterintuitive to us as they were to our ancestors. The second version of this book reflects the author's drift into becoming a little less of a student of uncertainty — we can learn so little about randomness — and more of a researcher into how people are fooled by it. Another phenomenon: the transformation of the author by his own book. As I increasingly started living this book after the initial composition, I found luck in the most unexpected of places. It is as if there were two planets, the one in which we actually live, and the one, considerably more deterministic, on which people are convinced we live. It is as simple as that. Past events will always look less random than they were. It is called the hindsight bias. I would listen to someone's discussion of his own past, realizing that much of what he was saying was just back-fit explanations, concocted ex post by his deluded mind. This became at times unbearable. I could feel myself looking at people in the social sciences, particularly conventional economics, and in the investment world, as if they were deranged subjects. Living in the real world may be painful, particularly if one finds statements more informative about the people making them than the intended message. I picked up Newsweek this morning at the dentist's office, and read a journalist's discussion of a prominent business figure, particularly his ability in timing moves, and realized how I was making a list of the biases in the journalist's mind, rather than getting the intended information in the article itself, which I could not possibly take seriously. Why don't most journalists end up figuring out that they know much less than they think they know? Scientists investigated half a century ago the phenomena of experts not learning about their past failings. You can mispredict everything for all your life, yet think that you will get it right next time. Insecurity and probability. I believe that the principal asset I need to protect and cultivate is my deep-seated intellectual insecurity. My motto is, "My principal activity is to tease those who take themselves and the quality of their knowledge too seriously." Cultivating such insecurity in place of intellectual confidence may be a strange aim, and one that is not easy to implement. To do so, we need to purge our minds of the recent tradition of intellectual certainties. A reader-turned-pen pal made me rediscover the 16th century French essayist and professional introspector Montaigne. I got sucked into the implications of the difference between Montaigne and Descartes, and how we strayed by following the latter's quest for certitudes. We surely closed our minds by following Descartes' model of formal thinking, rather than Montaigne's brand of vague and informal, but critical, judgment. Half a millennium later, the severely introspecting and insecure Montaigne stands tall as a role model for the modern thinker. In addition, the man had exceptional courage. It certainly takes bravery to remain skeptical. It takes inordinate courage to introspect, to confront oneself, to accept one's limitations. Scientists are seeing more and more evidence that we are specifically designed by Mother Nature to fool ourselves. There are many intellectual approaches to probability and risk. Probability means slightly different things to people in different disciplines. In this book, it is tenaciously qualitative and literary, as opposed to quantitative and scientific, which explains the warnings against economists and finance professors, as they tend to firmly believe that they know something, and something useful at that. It is presented as flowing from Hume's problem of induction, or Aristotle's inference to the general, as opposed to the paradigm of the gambling literature. In this book, probability is principally a branch of applied skepticism, not an engineering discipline. In spite of all the self-important mathematical treatment of the subject matter, problems related to the calculus of probability rarely merit to transcend the footnote. How? Probability is not a mere computation of odds on the dice, or more complicated variants. It is the acceptance of the lack of certainty in our knowledge and the development of methods for dealing with our ignorance. Outside of textbooks and casinos, probability almost never presents itself as a mathematical problem or a brain teaser. Mother Nature does not tell you how many holes there are on the roulette table, nor does she deliver problems in a textbook way. In the real world, one has to guess the problem more than the solution. In this book, considering that alternative outcomes could have taken place, that the world could have been different, is the core of probabilistic thinking. As a matter of fact, I spent all my career attacking the quantitative use of probability. While chapters 13 and 14, dealing with skepticism and stoicism, are to me the central ideas of the book, most people focused on the examples of miscomputation of probability in chapter 11. Clearly and by far the least original chapter of the book, one in which I compressed all the literature on probability biases. In addition, while we may have some understanding of the probabilities in the hard sciences, particularly in physics, we don't have much of a clue in the social sciences like economics, in spite of the fanfares of experts. Vindicating some readers. I have tried to make the minimum out of my occupation of mathematical trader. The fact that I operate in the markets serves only as an inspiration. It does not make this book, as many thought it was, a guide to market randomness, any more than the Iliad should be interpreted as a military instruction manual. Only 3 out of 14 chapters have a financial setting. Markets are a mere special case of randomness traps, but they are by far the most interesting as luck plays a very large role in them. This book would have been considerably shorter if I were a taxidermist or a translator of chocolate labels. Furthermore, the kind of luck in finance is of the kind that nobody understands, but most operators think they understand, which provides us a magnification of the biases. I've tried to use my market analogies in an illustrative way, as I would in a dinner conversation with, say, a cardiologist with intellectual curiosity. I used as a model my second-generation friend, Jacques Merab. I received large quantities of electronic mail on the first version of the book, which can be an essayist's dream, as such dialectic provides ideal conditions for the rewriting of the second version. I expressed my gratitude by answering, once, each one of them. Some of the answers have been inserted back into the text, in the different chapters. Being often seen as an iconoclast, I was looking forward to getting the angry letters of the type, "Who are you to judge Warren Buffett?" or "You are envious of his success." Instead, I was disappointed to see most of the trashing going anonymously to Amazon.com. There is no such thing as bad publicity. Some people manage to promote your work by insulting it. The consolation for the lack of attacks was in the form of letters from people who felt vindicated by the book. The most rewarding letters were the ones from people who did not fare well in life, through no fault of their own, and who used the book as an argument with their spouse to explain that they were less lucky, not less skilled, than their brother-in-law. The most touching letter came from a man in Virginia, who within a period of a few months lost his job, his wife, his fortune, was put under investigation by the redoubtable Securities and Exchange Commission, and progressively felt good for acting stoical. A correspondence with a reader who was hit with a black swan, the unexpected large-impact random event, the loss of a baby, caused me to spend some time dipping into the literature on adaptation after a severe random event, not coincidentally also dominated by Daniel Kahneman, the pioneer of the ideas on irrational behavior under uncertainty. I have to confess that I never felt really particularly directly of service to anyone being a traitor, except myself. It felt elevating and useful being an essayist. All or none. A few confusions with the message in this book. Just as our brain does not easily make out probabilistic shades, it goes for the oversimplifying all or none, it was hard to explain that the idea here was that it is more random than we think, rather than it is all random. I had to face the Taleb, as a skeptic, thinks everything is random, and successful people are just lucky. The fooled by randomness symptom even affected a well-publicized Cambridge Union debate, as my argument, most city hotshots are lucky fools, became all city hotshots are lucky fools. Clearly, I lost the debate to the formidable Desmond Fitzgerald in one of the most entertaining discussions in my life. I was even tempted to switch sides. The same delusion of mistaking irreverence for arrogance, as I noticed with my message, makes people confuse skepticism for nihilism. Let me make it clear here. Of course, chance favors the prepared. Hard work, showing up on time, wearing a clean, preferably white, shirt, using deodorant and some such conventional things contribute to success. They are certainly necessary, but may be insufficient, as they do not cause success. The same applies to the conventional values of persistence, doggedness, and perseverance. Necessary. Very necessary. One needs to go out and buy a lottery ticket in order to win. Does it mean that the work involved in the trip to the store caused the winning? Of course, skills count, but they do count less in highly random environments than they do in dentistry. No, I am not saying that what your grandmother told you about the value of work ethics is wrong. Furthermore, as most successes are caused by very few windows of opportunity, failing to grab one can be deadly for one's career. Take your luck. Notice how our brain sometimes gets the arrow of causality backward. Assume that good qualities cause success. Based on that assumption, even though it seems intuitively correct to think so, the fact that every intelligent, hard-working, persevering person becomes successful does not imply that every successful person is necessarily an intelligent, hard-working, persevering person. It is remarkable how such a primitive, logical fallacy, affirming the consequent, can be made by otherwise very intelligent people, a point I discuss in this edition as the two systems of reasoning problem. There is a twist in research on success that has found its way into the bookstores under the banner of advice on, "These are the millionaire's traits that you need to have if you want to be just like those successful people." One of the authors of the misguided The Millionaire Next Door, that I discuss in Chapter 8, wrote another even more foolish book called The Millionaire Mind. He observes that in the representative cohort of more than 1,000 millionaires whom he studied, most did not exhibit high intelligence in their childhood, and infers that it is not your endowment that makes you rich, but rather hard work. From this one can naively infer that chance plays no part in success. My intuition is that if millionaires are close in attributes to the average population, then I would make the more disturbing interpretation that it is because luck played a part. Luck is democratic and hits everyone, regardless of original skills. The author notices variations from the general population in a few traits like tenacity and hard work, another confusion of the necessary and the causal. That all millionaires were persistent, hard-working people does not make persistent hard workers become millionaires. Plenty of unsuccessful entrepreneurs were persistent, hard-working people. In a textbook case of naive empiricism, the author also looked for traits these millionaires had in common and figured out that they shared a taste for risk-taking. Clearly, risk-taking is necessary for large success, but it is also necessary for failure. Had the author done the same study on bankrupt citizens, he would certainly have found a predilection for risk-taking. I was asked to back up the claims in the book with the supply of data, graphs, charts, diagrams, plots, tables, numbers, recommendations, time series, etc., by some readers, and by Me Too publishers before I was lucky to find Texair. This text is a series of logical thought experiments, not an economics term paper. Logic does not require empirical verification. Again, there is what I call a round-trip fallacy. It is a mistake to use, as journalists and some economists do, statistics without logic, but the reverse does not hold. It is not a mistake to use logic without statistics. If I write that I doubt that my neighbor's success is devoid of some measure, small or large, of luck, owing to the randomness of his profession, I do not need to test it. The Russian roulette thought experiment suffices. All I need is to show that there exists an alternative explanation to the theory that he is a genius. My approach is to manufacture a cohort of intellectually challenged persons, and show how a small minority can evolve into successful businessmen. But these are the ones who will be visible. I am not saying that Warren Buffett is not skilled, only that a large population of random investors will almost necessarily produce someone with his track records just by Luck. Missing a hoax. I was also surprised at the fact that in spite of the book's aggressive warning against media journalism, I was invited to television and radio shows in both North America and Europe, including a hilarious dialogue du soir on a Las Vegas radio station where the interviewer and I were running two parallel conversations. Nobody protected me from myself, and I accepted the interviews. Strangely, one needs to use the press to communicate the message that the press is toxic. I felt like a fraud coming up with vapid sound bites, but had fun at it. It may be that I was invited because the mainstream media interviewers did not read my book or understand the insults. They don't have the time to read books. And the non-profit ones read it too well and felt vindicated by it. I have a few anecdotes. A famous television show was told that this guy Taleb believes that stock analysts are just random forecasters. So they seemed eager to have me present my ideas on the program. However, their condition was that I make 3 stock recommendations to prove my expertise. I didn't attend, and missed the opportunity for a great hoax by discussing 3 stocks selected randomly and fitting a well-sounded explanation to my selection. On another television show, I mentioned that people think that there is a story when there is none, as I was discussing the random character of the stock market and the backfit logic one always sees in events after the fact. The anchor immediately interjected, "There was a story about Cisco this morning. Can you comment on that?" The best? When invited to an hour-long discussion on a financial radio show, they had not read Chapter 11, I was told a few minutes before to refrain from discussing the ideas in this book because I was invited to talk about trading and not about randomness. Another hoax opportunity, certainly, but I was too unprepared for it and walked out before the show started. Most journalists do not take things too seriously. After all, this business of journalism is about pure entertainment, not a search for truth, particularly when it comes to radio and television. The trick is to stay away from those who do not seem to know that they are just entertainers, like George Will, who will appear in Chapter 2, and actually believe that they are thinkers. Another problem was in the interpretation of the message in the media. This guy Nassim thinks the markets are random, hence they are going lower, which made me the unwilling bearer of catastrophic messages. Black swans, those rare and unexpected deviations, can be both good and bad events. However, media journalism is less standardized than it appears. It attracts a significant segment of thoughtful people who manage to extricate themselves from the commercial soundbite-driven system and truly care about the message, rather than just catching the public's attention. One naive observation from my conversations with Kojo Nnamdi, NPR, Robin Lustig, BBC, Robert Scully, PBS, and Brian Lara, WNYC, is that the non-profit journalist is altogether another intellectual breed. Casually, the quality of the discussion correlates inversely with the luxury of the studios. WNYC, where I felt that Brian Lara was making the greatest effort at getting into the arguments, operates out of the shabbiest offices I have seen this side of Kazakhstan. One final comment on the style. I elected to keep the style of this book as idiosyncratic as it was in the first edition. Homo sum, good and bad. I am fallible, and see no reason to hide my minor flaws if they are part of my personality, no more than I feel the need to wear a wig when I have my picture taken, or borrow someone else's nose when I show my face. Almost all the book editors who read the draft recommended changes at the sentence level to make my style better, and in the structure of the text, in the organization of chapters. I ignored almost all of them, and found out that none of the readers thought them necessary. As a matter of fact, I find that injecting the personality of the author, imperfections included, enlivens the text. Does the book industry suffer from the classical expert problem with the buildup of rules of thumb that do not have empirical validity? More than 100,000 readers later, I am discovering that books are not written for book editors. Prologue. Mosques in the Clouds. This book is about luck, disguised and perceived as non-luck, that is, skills, and more generally, randomness disguised and perceived as non-randomness, that is, determinism. It manifests itself in the shape of the lucky fool, defined as a person who benefited from a disproportionate share of luck, but attributes his success to some other, generally very precise, reason. Such confusion crops up in the most unexpected areas, even science, though not in such an accentuated and obvious manner as it does in the world of business. It is endemic in politics, as it can be encountered in the shape of a country's president, discoursing on the jobs that he created, his recovery, and his predecessor's inflation. We are still very close to our ancestors who roamed the savannah. The formation of our beliefs is fraught with superstitions, even today, I might say especially today. Just as one day some primitive tribesman scratched his nose, saw rain falling, and developed an elaborate method of scratching his nose to bring on the much-needed rain, we link economic prosperity to some rate cut by the Federal Reserve Board, or the success of a company with the appointment of the new president at the helm. Bookstores are full of biographies of successful men and women, presenting their specific explanation on how they made it big in life. We have an expression, the right time at the right place, to weaken whatever conclusion can be inferred from them. This confusion strikes people of different persuasions. The literature professor invests a deep meaning into a mere coincidental occurrence of word patterns, while the economist proudly detects regularities and anomalies in data that are plain random. At the cost of appearing biased, I have to say that the literary mind can be intentionally prone to the confusion between noise and meaning, that is, between a randomly constructed arrangement and a precisely intended message. However, this causes little harm. Few claim that art is a tool of investigation of the truth, rather than an attempt to escape it, or make it more palatable. Symbolism is the child of our inability and unwillingness to accept randomness. We give meaning to all manner of shapes. We detect human figures in ink blots. "I saw mosques in the clouds," announced Arthur Rimbaud, the 19th century French symbolic poet. This interpretation took him to poetic Abyssinia in East Africa, where he was brutalized by a Christian Lebanese slave dealer, contracted syphilis, and lost a leg to gangrene. He gave up poetry in disgust at the age of 19 and died, anonymously, in a Marseille hospital ward while still in his 30s. But it was too late. European intellectual life developed what seemed to be an irreversible taste for symbolism. We are still paying its price, with psychoanalysis and other fads. Regrettably, some people play the game too seriously. They are paid to read too much into things. All my life I have suffered the conflict between my love of literature and poetry, and my profound allergy to most teachers of literature and critics. The French thinker and poet Paul Valéry was surprised to listen to a commentary of his poems that found meanings that had until then escaped him. Of course, it was pointed out to him that these were intended by his subconscious. More generally, we underestimate the share of randomness in about everything, a point that may not merit a book, except when it is the specialist who is the fool of all fools. Disturbingly, science has only recently been able to handle randomness. The growth in available information has been exceeded only by the expansion of noise. Probability theory is a young arrival in mathematics. Probability applied to practice is almost non-existent as a discipline. In addition, we seem to have evidence that what is called courage comes from an underestimation of the share of randomness in things, rather than the more noble ability to stick one's neck out for a given belief. In my experience, and in the scientific literature, Economic risk-takers are rather the victims of delusions, leading to over-optimism and over-confidence with their underestimation of possible adverse outcomes, than the opposite. Their risk-taking is frequently randomness foolishness. Consider the left and right columns of the Table of Confusion, which I will read in just a moment. The best way to summarize the major thesis of this book is that it addresses situations, many of them tragicomical, where the first item in the left column is mistaken for the one in the right. The subsections also illustrate the key areas of discussion on which this book will be based. The reader may wonder whether the opposite case might not deserve some attention, that is, the situations where non-randomness is mistaken for randomness. Shouldn't we be concerned with situations where patterns and messages may have been ignored? I have two answers. First, I am not overly worried about the existence of undetected patterns. We have been reading lengthy and complex messages in just about any manifestation of nature that presents jaggedness, such as the palm of a hand, the residues at the bottom of Turkish coffee cups, etc. Armed with home supercomputers and chained processors, and helped by complexity and chaos theories, the scientists, semi-scientists, and pseudo-scientists will be able to find portents. Second, we need to take into account the costs of mistakes. In my opinion, mistaking the items in the right-hand column from the ones in the left is not as costly an error in the opposite direction. Even popular opinion warns that bad information is worse than no information at all. So here's the Table of Confusion, presenting the central distinctions used in this book. Under the general category, luck versus skills, randomness versus determinism, probability versus certainty, belief and conjecture versus knowledge and certitude, theory versus reality, anecdote and coincidence versus causality and law, and forecast versus prophecy. Under the market performance category, lucky idiot versus skilled investor, and survivorship bias versus market outperformance. In the finance category, we have volatility versus return or drift, and stochastic variable versus deterministic variable. In the physics and engineering category, noise versus signal. In the literary criticism category, we have none. Literary critics do not seem to have a name for things they do not understand. Versus symbol. In the philosophy of science category, epistemic probability versus physical probability, induction versus deduction, and synthetic proposition versus analytic proposition. And finally, in the general philosophy category, we have contingent versus certain, contingent versus necessary in the Kripke sense, and finally, contingent versus true in all possible worlds. However interesting these areas could be, their discussion would be a tall order. There is one world in which I believe the habit of mistaking luck for skill is most prevalent and most conspicuous, and that is the world of markets. By luck or misfortune, that is the world in which I have operated most of my adult life. It is what I know best. In addition, economic life presents the best and most entertaining laboratory for the understanding of these differences. For it is in the area of human undertaking where the confusion is greatest and its effects the most pernicious. For instance, we often have the mistaken impression that a strategy is an excellent strategy, or an entrepreneur a person endowed with vision, or a trader a talented trader, only to realize that 99.9% of their past performance is attributable to chance, and chance alone. Ask a profitable investor to explain the reasons for his success. He will offer some deep and convincing interpretation of the results. Frequently, these delusions are intentional and deserve to bear the name charlatanism. If there is one cause for this confusion between the left and the right sides of our table of confusion, it is our inability to think critically. We may enjoy presenting conjectures as truth. It is our nature. Our mind is not equipped with the adequate machinery to handle probabilities. Such infirmity even strikes the expert, sometimes just the expert. The 19th century cartoon character, pot-bellied bourgeois Monsieur Prudhomme, carried around a large sword with a double intent, primarily to defend the Republic against its enemies, and secondarily to attack it should it stray from its course. In the same manner, this book has two purposes: to defend science, as a light beam across the noise of randomness, and to attack the scientist when he strays from his course. Most disasters come from the fact that individual scientists do not have an innate understanding of standard error or a clue about critical thinking, and likewise have proved both incapable of dealing with probabilities in the social sciences and incapable of accepting such fact. As a practitioner of uncertainty, I have seen more than my share of snake oil salesmen dressed in the garb of scientists, particularly those operating in economics. The greatest fools of randomness will be found among these. We are flawed beyond repair, at least for this environment. But it is only bad news for those utopians who believe in an idealized humankind. Current thinking presents the two following polarized visions of man, with little shades in between. On the one hand, there is your local college English professor, your great-aunt Irma, who never married and liberally delivers sermons, your How to Reach Happiness in 20 Steps and How to Become a Better Person in a Week book writer. It is called the utopian vision, associated with Rousseau, Godwin, Carita, Thomas Paine, and conventional normative economists, of the kind to ask you to make rational choices because that is what is deemed good for you, etc. They believe in reason and rationality, that we should overcome cultural impediments on our way to becoming a better human race, thinking we can control our nature at will and transform it by mere edict in order to attain, among other things, happiness and rationality. Basically, this category would include those who think that the cure for obesity is to inform people that they should be healthy. On the other hand, there is the tragic vision of humankind that believes in the existence of inherent limitations and flaws in the way we think and act, and requires an acknowledgement of this fact as a basis for any individual and collective action. This category of people includes Karl Popper, falsificationism and distrust of intellectual answers, actually of anyone who is confident that he knows anything with certainty, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, suspicion of governments, Adam Smith, intention of man, Herbert Simon, bounded rationality, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, heuristics and biases, the speculator George Soros, etc. The most neglected one is the misunderstood philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, who was born 100 years too early. He coined the term scientific fallibilism in opposition to papal infallibility. Needless to say that the ideas of this book fall squarely into the tragic category. We are faulty, and there is no need to bother trying to correct our flaws. We are so defective and so mismatched to our environment that we can just work around these flaws. I am convinced that after spending almost all my adult and professional years in a fierce fight between my brain, not fooled by randomness, and my emotions, completely fooled by randomness, in which the only success I've had is in going around my emotions, rather than rationalizing them. Perhaps ridding ourselves of our humanity is not in the works. We need wily tricks, not some grandiose moralizing help. As an empiricist, actually a skeptical empiricist, I despise the moralizers beyond anything on this planet. I still wonder why they blindly believe in ineffectual methods. Delivering advice assumes that our cognitive apparatus, rather than our emotional machinery, exerts some meaningful control over our actions. We will see how modern behavioral science shows this to be completely untrue. My colleague, Bob Yeager, he followed the opposite course of mine of moving from philosophy professor to traitor, presents a more potent view of the dichotomy. There are those who think that there are easy, clear-cut answers, and those who don't think that simplification is possible without severe distortion. His hero? Wittgenstein. His villain? Descartes. I am enamored of the difference, as I think that the generator of the fooled by randomness problem, the false belief in determinism, is also associated with such reduction of the dimensionality of things. As much as you believe in the keep it simple, stupid, it is the simplification that is dangerous. This author hates books that can be easily guessed from the table of contents. Not many people read textbooks for pleasure. But a hint of what comes next seems in order. The book is composed of 3 parts. The first is an introspection into Solon's warning, as his outburst on rare events became my lifelong motto. In it we meditate on visible and invisible histories, and the elusive property of rare events, black swans. The second presents a collection of probability biases I encountered, and suffered from, in my career in randomness, ones that continue to fool me. The third illustrates my personal jousting with my biology, and concludes the book with the presentation of a few practical, wax in my ears, and philosophical, stoicism, aids. Before the Enlightenment and the age of rationality, there was in the culture a collection of tricks to deal with our fallibility and reversals of fortunes. The elders can still help us with some of their ruses. Part 1. Solon's Warning. Skewness, Asymmetry, Induction. Croesus, king of Lydia, was considered the richest man of his time. To this day, Romance languages use the expression rich as Croesus to describe a person of excessive wealth. He was said to be visited by Solon, the Greek legislator known for his dignity, reserve, moral uprights, humility, frugality, wisdom, intelligence, and courage. Solon did not display the smallest surprise at the wealth and splendor surrounding his host, nor the tiniest admiration for their owner. Croesus was so irked by the manifest lack of impression on the part of his illustrious visitor that he attempted to extract from him some acknowledgment. He asked him if he had known a happier man than him. Solon cited the life of a man who led a noble existence and died while in battle. Prodded for more, he gave similar examples of heroic but terminated lives, until Croesus, irate, asked him point-blank if he was not to be considered the happiest man of all. Solon answered, "The observation of the numerous misfortunes that attend all conditions forbids us to grow insolent upon our present enjoyments, or to admire a man's happiness that may yet, in course of time, suffer change. For the uncertain future has yet to come, with all variety of future, and him only to whom the divinity has guaranteed continued happiness until the end may we call happy." The modern equivalent has been no less eloquently voiced by the baseball coach Yogi Berra, who seems to have translated Solon's outburst from the pure Attic Greek into no less pure Brooklyn English with, "It ain't over until it's over," or in a less dignified manner, with, "It ain't over until the fat lady sings." In addition, aside from his use of the vernacular, the Yogi Berra quote presents an advantage of being true, while the meeting between Croesus and Solon was one of those historical facts that benefited from the imagination of the chroniclers, as it was chronologically impossible for the two men to have been in the same location. Part 1 is concerned with the degree to which a situation may yet, in the course of time, suffer change. For we can be tricked by situations involving mostly the activities of the goddess Fortuna, Jupiter's firstborn daughter. Solon was wise enough to get the following point. That which came with the help of luck can be taken away by luck, and often rapidly, and unexpectedly at that. The flip side, which deserves to be considered as well, in fact it is even more of our concern, is that things that come with little help from luck are more resistant to randomness. Solon also had the intuition of a problem that has obsessed science for the past 3 centuries. It is called the problem of induction. I call it in this book the black swan, or the rare event. Solon even understood another linked problem, which I call the skewness issue. It does not matter how frequently someone succeeds if failure is too costly to bear. Yet the story of Croesus has another twist. Having lost a battle to the redoubtable Persian king Cyrus, he was about to be burned alive when he called Solon's name and shouted something like, "Solon, you were right!" Again, this is legend. Cyrus asked about the nature of such unusual invocations, and he told him about Solon's warning. This impressed Cyrus so much that he decided to spare Croesus' life, as he reflected on the possibilities as far as his own fate was concerned. People were thoughtful at that time. Chapter 1. If you're so rich, why aren't you so smart? An illustration of the effect of randomness on social pecking order and jealousy through 2 characters of opposite attitudes. On the concealed rare event, how things in modern life may change rather rapidly, except perhaps in dentistry. Nero Tulip, hit by lightning. Nero Tulip became obsessed with trading after witnessing a strange scene one spring day as he was visiting the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. A red convertible Porsche, driven at several times the city speed limit, abruptly stopped in front of the entrance, its tires emitting the sound of pigs being slaughtered. A visibly demented athletic man in his 30s, his face flushed red, emerged and ran up the steps as if he were chased by a tiger. He left the car double-parked, its engine running, provoking an angry fanfare of horns. After a long minute, a bored young man clad in a yellow jacket — yellow was the color reserved for clerks — came down the steps, visibly untroubled by the traffic commotion. He drove the car into the underground parking garage, perfunctorily, as if it were his daily chore. That day, Nero Tulip was hit with what the French call a coup de foudre, a sudden, intense, and obsessive infatuation that strikes like lightning. "This is for me!" he screamed enthusiastically. He could not help comparing the life of a trader to the alternative lives that could present themselves to him. Academia conjured up the image of a silent university office with rude secretaries. Business, the image of a quiet office staffed with slow thinkers and semi-slow thinkers who expressed themselves in full sentences. Temporary sanity. Unlike a coup de foudre, the infatuation triggered by the Chicago scene has not left him more than a decade and a half after the incident. For Nero swears that no other lawful profession in our times could be as devoid of boredom as that of the trader. Furthermore, although he has not yet practiced the profession of high-sea piracy, he is now convinced that even that occupation would present more dull moments than that of the trader. Nero could best be described as someone who randomly and abruptly swings between the deportment and speech manners of a church historian and the verbally abusive intensity of a Chicago pit trader. He can commit hundreds of millions of dollars in a transaction without a blink or a shadow of a second thought, yet agonize between 2 appetizers on the menu, changing his mind back and forth and wearing out the most patient of waiters. Nero holds an undergraduate degree in ancient literature and mathematics from Cambridge University. He enrolled in a PhD program in statistics at the University of Chicago, But, after completing the prerequisite coursework, as well as the bulk of his doctoral research, he switched to the philosophy department. He called the switch a moment of temporary sanity, adding to the consternation of his thesis director, who warned him against philosophers and predicted his return back to the fold. He finished writing his thesis in philosophy, but not in the Derrida continental style of incomprehensible philosophy, that is, incomprehensible to anyone outside of their ranks, like myself. It was quite the opposite. His thesis was on the methodology of statistical inference in its application to the social sciences. In fact, his thesis was indistinguishable from a thesis in mathematical statistics. It was just a bit more thoughtful, and twice as long. It is often said that philosophy cannot feed its man, but that was not the reason Nero left. He left because philosophy cannot entertain its man. At first it started looking futile. He recalled his statistics thesis director's warnings. Then, suddenly, it started to look like work. As he became tired of writing papers on some arcane details of his earlier papers, he gave up the academy. The academic debates bored him to tears, particularly when minute points, invisible to the non-initiated, were at stake. Action was what Nero required. The problem, however, was that he selected the academy in the first place in order to kill what he detected was the flatness and tempered submission of employment life. After witnessing the scene of the trader chased by a tiger, Nero found a trainee spot on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the large exchange where traders transact by shouting and gesticulating frenetically. There he worked for a prestigious but eccentric local who trained him in the Chicago style, in return for Nero solving his mathematical equations. The energy in the air proved motivating to Nero. He rapidly graduated to the rank of self-employed trader. Then, when he got tired of standing on his feet in the crowd and straining his vocal cords, he decided to seek employment upstairs, that is, trading from a desk. He moved to the New York area and took a position with an investment house. Nero specialized in quantitative financial products, in which he had an early moment of glory, became famous, and in demand. Many investment houses in New York and London flashed huge guaranteed bonuses at him. Nero spent a couple of years shuttling between the two cities, attending important meetings and wearing expensive suits. But soon, Nero went into hiding. He rapidly pulled back to anonymity. The Wall Street stardom track did not quite fit his temperament. To stay a hot trader requires some organizational ambitions and a power hunger that he feels lucky not to possess. He was only in it for the fun, and his idea of fun does not include administrative and managerial work. He is susceptible to conference room boredom and is incapable of talking to businessmen, particularly the run-of-the-mill variety. Nero is allergic to the vocabulary of business talk, not just on plain aesthetic grounds. Phrases like game plan, bottom line, how to get there from here. We provide our clients with solutions. Our mission, and other hackneyed expressions that dominate meetings, lack both the precision and the coloration that he prefers to hear. Whether people populate silence with hollow sentences, or if such meetings present any true merit, he does not know. At any rate, he did not want to be part of it. Indeed, Nero's extensive social life includes almost no business people. But unlike me, I can be extremely humiliating when someone rubs me the wrong way with inelegant pompousness. Nero handles himself with gentle aloofness in these circumstances. So, Nero switched careers to what is called proprietary trading. Traders are set up as independent entities, internal funds with their own allocation of capital. They are left alone to do as they please, provided, of course, that their results satisfy the executives. The name proprietary comes from the fact that they trade the company's own capital. At the end of the year, they receive between 7 and 12% of the profits generated. The proprietary trader has all the benefits of self-employment and none of the burdens of running the mundane details of his own business. He can work any hours he likes, travel at a whim, and engage in all manner of personal pursuits. It is a paradise for an intellectual like Nero, who dislikes manual work and values unscheduled meditation. He has been doing that for the past 10 years, in the employment of 2 different trading firms. Modus operandi. A word on Nero's methods. He is as conservative a trader as one can be in such a business. In the past he has had good years and less than good years, but virtually no truly bad years. Over these years he has slowly built for himself a stable nest egg, thanks to an income ranging between $300,000 and, at its peak, $2.5 million. On average, he manages to accumulate $500,000 a year in after-tax money, from an average income of about $1 million. This goes straight into his savings account. In 1993, he had a bad year and was made to feel uncomfortable in his company. Other traders made out much better, so the capital at his disposal was severely reduced, and he was made to feel undesirable at the institution. He then went to get an identical job, down to an identically designed workspace, but in a different firm that was friendlier. In the fall of 1994, the traders who had been competing for the Great Performance Award blew up in unison during the worldwide bond market crash that resulted from the random tightening by the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. They are all currently out of the market, performing a variety of tasks. This business has a high mortality rate. Why isn't Nero more affluent? Because of his trading style, or perhaps his personality. His risk aversion is extreme. Nero's objective is not to maximize his profits, so much as it is to avoid having this entertaining machine called trading taken away from him. Blowing up would mean returning to the tedium of the university or the non-trading life. Every time his risks increase, he conjures up the image of the quiet hallway at the university, the long mornings at his desk spent in revising a paper, kept awake by bad coffee. No, he does not want to have to face the solemn university library where he was bored to tears. "I am shooting for longevity," he is wont to say. Nero has seen many traders blow up. He does not want to get into that situation. Blow up, in the lingo, has a precise meaning. It does not just mean to lose money. It means to lose more money than one ever expected, to the point of being thrown out of the business, the equivalent of a doctor losing his license to practice, or a lawyer being disbarred. Nero rapidly exits trades after a predetermined loss. He never sells naked options, a strategy that would leave him exposed to large possible losses. He never puts himself in a situation where he can lose more than, say, $1 million, regardless of the probability of such an event. That amount has always been variable. It depends on his accumulated profits for the year. This risk aversion prevented him from making as much money as the other traders on Wall Street, who are often called masters of the universe. The firms he has worked for generally allocate more money to traders with a different style from Nero, like John, whom we will encounter soon. Nero's temperament is such that he does not mind losing small change. "I love taking small losses," he says. "I just need my winners to be large." In no circumstances does he want to be exposed to those rare events, like panics or sudden crashes, that wipe a trader out in a flash. To the contrary, he wants to benefit from them. When people ask him why he does not hold on to losers, he invariably answers that he was trained by the most chicken of them all, the Chicago trader Steve-O, who taught him the business. This is not true. The real reason is his training in probability and his innate skepticism. There is another reason why Nero is not as rich as others in his situation. His skepticism does not allow him to invest any of his own funds outside of treasury bonds. He therefore missed out on the great bull market. The reason he offers is that it could have turned out to be a bear market and a trap. Nero harbors a deep suspicion that the stock market is some form of an investment scam and cannot bring himself to own a stock. The difference with people around him who were enriched by the stock market was that he was cash flow rich, but his assets did not inflate at all along with the rest of the world. His treasury bonds hardly changed in value. He contrasts himself with one of those startup technology companies that were massively cash flow negative, but for which the hordes developed some infatuation. This allowed the owners to become rich from their stock valuation, and thus dependent on the randomness of the market's election of the winner. The difference with his friends of the investing variety is that he did not depend on the bull market, and accordingly does not have to worry about a bear market at all. His net worth is not a function of the investment of his savings. He does not want to depend on his investments, but on his cash earnings for his enrichment. He takes not an inch of risk with his savings, which he invests in the safest possible vehicles. Treasury bonds are safe. They are issued by the United States government, and governments can hardly go bankrupt, since they can freely print their own currency to pay back their obligation. No work ethics. Today, at 39, after 14 years in the business, he can consider himself comfortably settled. His personal portfolio contains several $1 million in medium maturity treasury bonds, enough to eliminate any worry about the future. What he likes most about proprietary trading is that it requires considerably less time than other high-paying professions. In other words, it is perfectly compatible with his non-middle-class work ethic. Trading forces someone to think hard. Those who merely work hard generally lose their focus and intellectual energy. In addition, they end up drowning in randomness. Work ethics, Nero believes, draw people to focus on noise rather than the signal. This free time has allowed him to carry on a variety of personal interests. As Nero reads voraciously and spends considerable time in the gym and museums, he cannot have a lawyer's or a doctor's schedule. Nero found the time to go back to the statistics department where he started his doctoral studies and finished the harder science doctorate in statistics by rewriting his thesis in more concise terms. Nero now teaches, once a year, a half-semester seminar called History of Probabilistic Thinking in the Mathematics Department of New York University, a class of great originality that draws excellent graduate students. He has saved enough to be able to maintain his lifestyle in the future and has contingency plans perhaps to retire into writing popular essays of the scientific literary variety, with themes revolving around probability and indeterminism, but only if some event in the future causes the markets to shut down. Nero believes that risk-conscious hard work and discipline can lead someone to achieve a comfortable life with a very high probability. Beyond that, it is all randomness, either by taking enormous and unconscious risks or by being extraordinarily lucky. Mild success can be explainable by skills and labor. Wild success is attributable to variance. There are always secrets. Nero's probabilistic introspection may have been helped out by a dramatic event in his life, one that he kept to himself. A penetrating observer might detect in Nero a measure of suspicious exuberance, an unnatural drive. For his life is not as crystalline as it may seem. Nero harbors a secret, one that will be discussed in time. John, the high-yield trader. Through most of the 1990s, across the street from Nero's house, stood John's, a much larger one. John was a high-yield trader, but he was not a trader in the style of Nero. A brief professional conversation with him would have revealed that he presented the intellectual depth and sharpness of mind of an aerobics instructor, though not the physique. A purblind man could not have seen that John had been doing markedly better than Nero, or at least felt compelled to show it. He parked 2 top-of-the-line German cars in his driveway, his and hers, in addition to 2 convertibles, one of which was a collectible Ferrari, while Nero had been driving the same VW Cabriolet for almost a decade, and still does. The wives of John and Nero were acquaintances, of the health club type, but Nero's wife felt extremely uncomfortable in the company of John's. She felt that the lady was not merely trying to impress her, but was treating her like someone inferior. While Nero had become inured to the sight of traders getting rich, and trying too hard to become sophisticated by turning into wine collectors and opera lovers, his wife had rarely encountered repressed new wealth, the type of people who felt the sting of indigence at some point in their lives and want to get even by exhibiting their wares. The only dark side of being a trader, Nero often says, is the sight of money being showered on unprepared people who are suddenly taught that Vivaldi's Four Seasons is refined music. But it was hard for his spouse to be exposed almost daily to the neighbor who kept boasting of the new decorator they just hired. John and his wife were not the least uncomfortable with the fact that their library came with the leather-bound books. Her health club reading was limited to People magazine, but her shelves included a selection of untouched books by dead American authors. She also kept discussing unpronounceable, exotic locations where they would repair during their vacations without so much as knowing the smallest thing about the places. She would have been hard to explain on which continent the Seychelles Islands are located. Nero's wife is all too human, although she kept telling herself that she did not want to be in the shoes of John's wife. She felt as if she had been somewhat swamped in the competition of life. Somehow words and reason became ineffectual in front of an oversized diamond, a monstrous house, and a sports car collection. An overpaid hick. Nero also suffered the same ambitious feeling toward his neighbors. He was quite contemptuous of John, who represented about everything he was not and does not want to be, but there was the social pressure that was starting to weigh on him. In addition, he too would have liked to have sampled such excessive wealth. Intellectual contempt does not control personal envy. That house across the street kept getting bigger, with addition after addition, and Nero's discomfort kept apace. While Nero had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, both personally and intellectually, he was starting to consider himself as having missed a chance somewhere. In the pecking order of Wall Street, the arrival of such types as John had caused him to be a significant trader no longer. But while he used to not care about this, John, and his house and his cars, had started to gnaw away at him. All would have been well if Nero had not had that stupid large house across the street judging him with a superficial standard every morning. Was it the animal pecking order at play, with John's house size making Nero a beta male? Even worse, John was about 5 years his junior, and despite a shorter career, was making at least 10 times his income. When they used to run into each other, Nero had a clear feeling that John tried to put him down, with barely detectable but no less potent signs of condescension. Some days, John ignored him completely. Had John been a remote character, one Nero could only read about in the papers, the situation would have been different. But there John was, in flesh and bones, and he was his neighbor. The mistake Nero made was to start talking to him, as the rule of pecking order immediately emerged. Nero tried to soothe his discomfort by recalling the behavior of Swann, the character in Proust's In Search of Time Lost, a refined art dealer and man of leisure who was at ease with such men as his personal friend, the then Prince of Wales, but acted like he had to prove something in the presence of the middle class. It was much easier for Swann to mix with the aristocratic and well-established set of Guermantes than it was with the social climbing one of the Védérines, no doubt because he was far more confident in their presence. Likewise, Nero can exact some form of respect from prestigious and prominent people. He regularly takes long meditative walks in Paris and Venice with an erudite Nobel Prize-caliber scientist, the kind of person who no longer has to prove anything, who actively seeks his conversation. A very famous billionaire speculator calls him regularly to ask him his opinion on the valuation of some derivative securities. But there he was, obsessively trying to gain the respect of some overpaid hick with a cheap New Jersey accent. Had I been in Nero's shoes, I would have paraded some of my scorn to John with the use of body language. But again, Nero is a nice person. Clearly, John was not as well educated, well-bred, physically fit, or perceived as being as intelligent as Nero. But that was not all. He was not even as street-smart as him. Nero has met true street-smart people in the pits of Chicago, who exhibit a rapidity of thinking that he could not detect in John. Nero was convinced that the man was a confident, shallow thinker, who had done well because he never made an allowance for his vulnerability. But Nero could not, at times, repress his envy. He wondered whether it was an objective evaluation of John, or if it was his feelings of being slighted that led him to such an assessment of John. Perhaps it was Nero who was not quite the best trader. Maybe, if he had pushed himself harder or had sought the right opportunity, instead of thinking, writing articles, and reading complicated papers. Perhaps he should have been involved in the high-yield business, where he would have shined among those shallow thinkers like John. So Nero tried to soothe his jealousy by investigating the rules of pecking order. Psychologists have shown that most people prefer to make $70,000 when others around them are making $60,000, than to make $80,000 when others around them are making $90,000. Economics, schmeconomics, it is all pecking order, he thought. No such analysis could prevent him from assessing his condition in an absolute rather than a relative way. With John, Nero felt that, for all his intellectual training, he was just another one of those who would prefer to make less money, provided others made even less. Nero thought that there was at least a hint to support the idea of John being merely lucky. In other words, Nero, after all, might not need to move away from his neighbor's starter palazzo. There was hope that John would meet his undoing, for John seemed unaware of one large hidden risk he was taking, the risk of blowing up. A risk he could not see because he had too short an experience of the market, but also because he was not thoughtful enough to study history. How could John, with his coarse mind, otherwise be making so much money? This business of junk bonds depends on some knowledge of the odds, a calculation of the probability of the rare or random events. What do such fools know about odds? These traders use quantitative tools that give them the odds, and Nero disagrees with the methods used. This high-yield market resembles a nap on a railway track. One afternoon, the surprise train would run you over. You make money every month for a long time, then lose a multiple of your cumulative performance in a few hours. He has seen it with options sellers in 1987, 1989, 1992, and 1998. One day they are taken off the exchange floors, accompanied by oversized security men, and nobody ever sees them again. The big house is simply a loan. John might end up as a luxury car salesman somewhere in New Jersey, selling to the newly rich, who no doubt would feel comfortable in his presence. Nero cannot blow up. His less oversized abode, with its 4,000 books, is his own. No market event can take it away from him. Every one of his losses is limited. His trader's dignity will never be threatened. John, for his part, thought of Nero as a loser, and a snobbish, overeducated loser at that. Nero was involved in a mature business. He believed that he was way over the hill. "These prop traders are dying," he used to say. "They think they're smarter than everybody else, but they are passé." The red-hot summer. Finally, in September 1998, Nero was vindicated. One morning, while leaving to go to work, he saw John in his front yard, unusually smoking a cigarette. He was not wearing a business suit. He looked humble. His customary swagger was gone. Nero immediately knew that John had been fired. What he did not expect was that John also lost almost everything he had. We will see more details of John's losses in Chapter 5. Nero felt ashamed of his feelings of schadenfreude, the joy humans can experience upon their rivals' misfortunes, but he could not repress it. Aside from being unchivalrous, it was said to bring bad luck. Nero is weakly superstitious. But in this case, Nero's merriment did not come from the fact that John went back to his place in life, so much as it was from the fact that Nero's methods, beliefs, and track record had suddenly gained incredibility. Nero would be able to raise public money on his track record precisely because such a thing could not possibly happen to him. A repetition of such an event would pay off massively for him. Part of Nero's elation also came from the fact that he felt proud of his sticking to his strategy for so long, in spite of the pressure to be the alpha male. It was also because he would no longer question his trading style when others were getting rich because they misunderstood the structure of randomness and market cycles. Serotonin and randomness. Can we judge the success of people by their raw performance and their personal wealth? Sometimes, but not always. We will see how, at any point in time, a large section of businessmen with outstanding track records will be no better than randomly thrown darts. More curiously, and owing to a peculiar bias, cases will abound of the least skilled businessmen being the richest. However, they will fail to make an allowance for the role of luck in their performance. Lucky fools do not bear the slightest suspicion that they may be lucky fools. By definition, they do not know that they belong to such a category. They will act as if they deserved the money. Their strings of successes will inject them with so much serotonin, or some similar substance, that they will even fool themselves about their ability to outperform markets. Our hormonal system does not know whether our successes depend on randomness. One can notice it in their posture. A profitable trader will walk with an upright, dominant style, and will tend to talk more than a losing trader. Scientists found out that serotonin, a neurotransmitter, seems to command a large share of our human behavior. It sets a positive feedback, the virtuous cycle, but, owing to an external kick from randomness, can start a reverse motion and cause a vicious cycle. It has been shown that monkeys injected with serotonin will rise in the pecking order, which in turn causes an increase of the serotonin level in their blood, until the virtuous circle breaks and starts a vicious one. During the vicious cycle, failure will cause one to slide in the pecking order, causing a behavior that will bring about further drops in the pecking order. Likewise, an increase in personal performance, regardless of whether it is caused deterministically or by the agency of Lady Fortuna, induces a rise of serotonin in the subject, itself causing an increase of what is commonly called leadership ability. One is on a roll. Some imperceptible changes in deportment, like an ability to express oneself with serenity and confidence, make the subject look credible, as if he truly deserved the shekels. Randomness will be ruled out as a possible factor in the performance, until it rears its head once again and delivers the kick that will induce the downward spiral. A word on the display of emotions. Almost no one can conceal his emotions. Behavioral scientists believe that one of the main reasons why people become leaders is not from what skills they seem to possess, but rather from what extremely superficial impression they make on others through hardly perceptible physical signals. What we call today charisma, for example. The biology of the phenomenon is now well studied under the subject heading social emotions. Meanwhile, some historian will explain the success in terms of perhaps tactical skills, the right education, or some other theoretical reason seen in hindsight. In addition, there seems to be curious evidence of a link between leadership and a form of psychopathology, the sociopath, that encourages the non-blinking, self-confident, insensitive person to rally followers. People have often had the bad taste of asking me in a social setting if my day in trading was profitable. If my father were there, he would usually stop them by saying, "Never ask a man if he is from Sparta. If he were, he would have let you know such an important fact, and if he were not, you could hurt his feelings." Likewise, never ask a trader if he is profitable. You can easily see it in his gesture and gait. People in the profession can easily tell if traders are making or losing money. Head traders are quick at identifying an employee who is faring poorly. Their face will seldom reveal much, as people consciously attempt to gain control of their facial expressions. But the way they walk, the way they hold the telephone, and the hesitation in their behavior will not fail to reveal their true disposition. On the morning after John had been fired, he certainly lost much of his serotonin, unless it was another substance that researchers will discover in another decade. One cab driver in Chicago explained to me that he could tell if traders he picked up near the Chicago Board of Trade, a futures exchange, were doing well. "They get all puffed up," he said. I found it interesting and mysterious that he could detect it so rapidly. I later got some plausible explanation from evolutionary psychology, which claims that such physical manifestations of one's performance in life, just like an animal's dominant condition, can be used for signaling. It makes the winners seem easily visible, which is efficient in mate selection. Your dentist is rich, very rich. We close this chapter with a hint on the next discussion of resistance to randomness. Recall that Nero can be considered prosperous but not very rich by his day's standards. However, according to some strange accounting measure, we will see in the next chapter he is extremely rich on the average of lives he could have led. He takes so little risk in his trading career that there could have been very few disastrous outcomes. The fact that he did not experience John's success was the reason he did not suffer his downfall. He would be, therefore, wealthy according to this unusual and probabilistic method of accounting for wealth. Recall that Nero protects himself from the rare event. Had Nero had to relive his professional life a few million times, very few sample paths would be marred by bad luck. But owing to his conservatism, very few as well would be affected by extreme good luck. That is, in his life, stability would be similar to that of an ecclesiastic clock repairman. Naturally, we are discussing only his professional life, excluding his, sometimes volatile, private one. Arguably, in expectation, a dentist is considerably richer than the rock musician who is driven in a pink Rolls-Royce, the speculator who bids up the price of impressionist paintings, or the entrepreneur who collects private jets. For one cannot consider a profession without taking into account the average of the people who enter it, not the sample of those who have succeeded in it. We will examine the point later from the vantage point of the survivorship bias, but here in Part 1 we will look at it with respect to resistance to randomness. Consider two neighbors. John Doe A., a janitor, who won the New Jersey lottery and moved to a wealthy neighborhood, compared to John Doe B., his next-door neighbor of more modest condition, who has been drilling teeth 8 hours a day over the past 35 years. Clearly, one can say that, thanks to the dullness of his career, if John Doe B. had to relive his life a few thousand times since graduation from dental school, the range of possible outcomes would be rather narrow, assuming he is properly insured. At the best, he would end up drilling the rich teeth of the New York Park Avenue residents, while the worst would show him drilling those of some semi-deserted town full of trailers in the Catskills. Furthermore, assuming he graduated from a very prestigious teeth-drilling school, the range of outcomes would be even more compressed. As to John Doe A., if he had to relive his life 1,000,000 times, almost all of them would see him performing janitorial activities and spending endless dollars on fruitless lottery tickets, and 1 in 1,000,000 would see him winning the New Jersey lottery. The idea of taking into account both the observed and unobserved possible outcomes sounds like lunacy. For most people, probability is about what may happen in the future, not events in the observed past. An event that has already taken place has 100% probability, i.e., certainty. I have discussed the point with many people who platitudinously accuse me of confusing myth and reality. Myths, particularly well-aged ones, as we saw with Solon's warning, can be far more potent and provide us with more experience than plain reality. Chapter 2. A Bizarre Accounting Method. On Alternative Histories, a probabilistic view of the world, intellectual fraud, and the randomness wisdom of a Frenchman with steady bathing habits. How journalists are bred to not understand random series of events. Beware borrowed wisdom. How almost all great ideas concerning random outcomes are against conventional sapience. On the difference between correctness and intelligibility. Alternative History. I start with the platitude that one cannot judge a performance in any given field, war, politics, medicine, investments, by the results, but by the costs of the alternative, i.e., if history played out in a different way. Such substitute courses of events are called alternative histories. Clearly, the quality of a decision cannot be solely judged based on its outcome, but such a point seems to be voiced only by people who fail. Those who succeed attribute their success to the quality of their decision. Such opinion, that I followed the best course, is what politicians on their way out of office keep telling those members of the press who still listen to them, eliciting the customary, commiserating, "Yes, we know," that makes the sting even worse. And like many platitudes, this one, while being too obvious, is not easy to carry out in practice. Russian roulette. One can illustrate the strange concept of alternative histories as follows. Imagine an eccentric and bored tycoon offers you $10 million to play Russian roulette, i.e., to put a revolver containing one bullet in the 6 available chambers to your head and pull the trigger. Each realization would count as one history, for a total of 6 possible histories of equal probabilities. 5 out of these 6 histories would lead to enrichment. 1 would lead to a statistic, that is, an obituary with an embarrassing, but certainly original, cause of death. The problem is that only one of the histories is observed in reality, and the winner of $10 million would elicit the admiration and praise of some fatuous journalist, the very same ones who unconditionally admire the Forbes 500 billionaires. Like almost every executive I have encountered during an 18-year career on Wall Street, the role of such executives, in my view, being no more than a judge of results delivered in a random manner. The public observes the external signs of wealth without even having a glimpse at the source. We call such source the generator. Consider the possibility that the Russian roulette winner would be used as a role model by his family, friends, and neighbors. While the remaining 5 histories are not observable, the wise and thoughtful person could easily make a guess as to their attributes. It requires some thoughtfulness and personal courage. In addition, in time, if the roulette-betting fool keeps playing the game, the bad histories will tend to catch up with him. Thus, if a 25-year-old played Russian roulette, say, once a year, there would be a very slim possibility of his surviving until his 50th birthday. But if there are enough players, say thousands of 25-year-old players, we can expect to see a handful of extremely rich survivors and a very large cemetery. Here I have to admit that the example of Russian roulette is more than intellectual to me. I lost a comrade to this game during the Lebanese War, when we were in our teens. But there is more. I discovered that I had more than a shallow interest in literature thanks to the effect of Graham Greene's account of his flirt with such a game. It bore a stronger effect on me than the actual events I had recently witnessed. Greene claimed that he once tried to soothe the dullness of his childhood by pulling the trigger on a revolver, making me shiver at the thought that I had at least a 1 in 6 probability of having been without his novels. The reader can see my unusual notion of alternative accounting. $10 million earned through Russian roulette does not have the same value as $10 million earned through the diligent and artful practice of dentistry. They are the same, can buy the same goods, except that one's dependence on randomness is greater than the other. To an accountant, though, they would be identical. To your next-door neighbor, too. Yet, deep down, I cannot help but consider them as qualitatively different. The notion of such alternative accounting has interesting intellectual extensions, and lends itself to mathematical formulation, as we will see in the next chapter with our introduction of the Monte Carlo engine. Note that the use of such mathematics is only illustrative, aiming at getting the intuition of the point, and should not be interpreted as an engineering issue. In other words, one need not actually compute the alternative histories so much as assess their attributes. Mathematics is not just a numbers game. It is a way of thinking. We will see that probability is a qualitative subject. Possible worlds. Note that these ideas of alternative histories have been covered by separate disciplines in intellectual history, worth presenting quickly because they all seem to converge on the same concept of risk and uncertainty. Certainty is something that is likely to take place across the highest number of different alternative histories. Uncertainty concerns events that should take place in the lowest number of them. In philosophy, there has been considerable work on the subject, starting with Leibniz's idea of possible worlds. For Leibniz, God's mind included an infinity of possible worlds, of which he selected just one. These non-selected worlds are worlds of possibilities, and the one in which I am breathing and writing these lines is just one of them that happened to have been executed. Philosophers also have a branch of logic that specializes in the matter, whether some property holds across all possible worlds or if it holds across a single world, with ramifications into the philosophy of language called Possible Worlds Semantics, with such authors as Saul Kripke. In physics, there is the many-world interpretation in quantum mechanics, associated with the works of Hugh Everett in 1957, which considers that the universe branches out tree-like at each juncture. What we are living now is only one of these many worlds. Taken at a more extreme level, whenever numerous viable possibilities exist, the worlds split into many worlds, one world for each different possibility, causing the proliferation of parallel universes. I am an essayist trader in one of the parallel universes, plain as dust in another. Finally, in economics, economists study, perhaps unwittingly, some of the Leibnizian ideas with the possible states of nature pioneered by Kenneth Arrow and Gerard de Brue. This analytical approach to the study of economic uncertainty is called the state space method. It happens to be the cornerstone of neoclassical economic theory and mathematical finance. A simplified version is called scenario analysis, the series of what-ifs used in, say, the forecasting of sales for a fertilizer plant under different world conditions and demands for the smelly product. An even more vicious roulette. Reality is far more vicious than Russian roulette. First, it delivers the fatal bullet rather infrequently, like a revolver that would have hundreds, if not thousands, of chambers instead of 6. After a few dozen tries, one forgets about the existence of a bullet, under a numbing false sense of security. The point is dubbed in this book the Black Swan problem, which we cover in Chapter 7, as it is linked to the problem of induction, a problem that has kept a few thinkers awake at night. It is also related to a problem called denigration of history, as gamblers, investors, and decision-makers feel that the sorts of things that happen to others would not necessarily happen to them. Second, unlike a well-defined, precise game like Russian roulette, where the risks are visible to anyone capable of multiplying and dividing by 6, one does not observe the barrel of reality. Very rarely is the generator visible to the naked eye. One is thus capable of unwittingly playing Russian roulette and calling it by some alternative, low-risk name. We see the wealth being generated, never the processor, a matter that makes people lose sight of their risks and never consider the losers. The game seems terribly easy, and we play along carelessly. Even scientists, with all their sophistication in calculating probabilities, cannot deliver any meaningful answer about the odds, since knowledge of these depends on our witnessing the barrel of reality, of which we generally know nothing. Finally, there is an ingratitude factor in warning people about something abstract. By definition, anything that did not happen is abstract. Say you engage in a business of protecting investors from rare events by constructing packages that shield them from their sting, something I have done on occasion. Say that nothing happens during the period. Some investors will complain about your spending their money. Some will even try to make you feel sorry. You wasted my money on insurance last year. The factory did not burn. It was a stupid expense. You should only insure for events that happen. One investor came to see me fully expecting me to be apologetic. It did not work. But the world is not that homogeneous. There are some, though very few, who will call you to express their gratitude and thank you for having protected them from the events that did not take place. Smooth peer relations. The degree of resistance to randomness in one's life is an abstract idea, part of its logic counterintuitive, and to confuse matters, its realizations non-observable. But I have been increasingly devoted to it, for a collection of personal reasons I will leave for later. Clearly, my way of judging matters is probabilistic in nature. It relies on the notion of what could have probably happened, and requires a certain mental attitude with respect to one's observations. I do not recommend engaging an accountant in a discussion about such probabilistic considerations. For an accountant, a number is a number. If he were interested in probability, he would have gotten involved in a more introspective profession, and would be inclined to make a costly mistake on your tax return. While we do not see the roulette barrel of reality, some people give it a try. It takes a special mindset to do so. Having seen hundreds of people enter and exit my profession, characterized by extreme dependence on randomness, I have to say that those who have had a modicum of scientific training tend to go the extra mile. For many, such thinking is second nature. This might not necessarily come from their scientific training per se, beware of causality, but possibly from the fact that people who have decided at some point in their lives to devote themselves to scientific research tend to have an ingrained intellectual curiosity and a natural tendency for such introspection. Particularly thoughtful are those who had to abandon scientific studies because of their inability to keep focused on a narrowly defined problem, or in Nero's case, the minute arcane details and petty arguments. Without excessive intellectual curiosity, it is almost impossible to complete a PhD thesis these days. But without a desire to narrowly specialize, it is impossible to make a scientific career. There is a distinction, however, between the mind of a pure mathematician thriving on abstraction and that of a scientist consumed by curiosity. A mathematician is absorbed in what goes into his head, while a scientist searches into what is outside of himself. However, some people's concern for randomness can be excessive. I have even seen people trained in some fields like, say, quantum mechanics, push the idea to the other extreme, only seeing alternative histories in the many-world interpretation, and ignoring the one that actually took place. Some traders can be unexpectedly introspective about randomness. Not long ago I had dinner at the bar of a Tribeca restaurant with Lauren Rose, a trader who was reading an early draft of this book. We flipped a coin to see who was going to pay for the meal. I lost and paid. He was about to thank me when he abruptly stopped and said that he paid for half of it probabilistically. I thus view people distributed across two polar categories. On one extreme, those who never accept the notion of randomness. On the other, those who are tortured by it. When I started on Wall Street in the 1980s, trading rooms were populated with people with a business orientation, that is, generally devoid of any introspection, flat as a pancake, and likely to be fooled by randomness. Their failure rate was extremely high, particularly when financial instruments gained in complexity. Somehow, tricky products like exotic options were introduced and carried counterintuitive payoffs that were too difficult for someone of such culture to handle. They dropped like flies. I do not think that many of the hundreds of MBAs of my generation I met on Wall Street in the 1980s still engage in such forms of professional and disciplined risk-taking. Salvation via Aeroloft. The 1990s witnessed the arrival of people of richer and more interesting backgrounds, which made the trading rooms far more entertaining. I was saved from the conversation of MBAs. Many scientists, some of them extremely successful in their field, arrived with the desire to make a buck. They, in turn, hired people who resembled them. While most of these people were not PhDs, indeed the PhD is still a minority, the culture and values suddenly changed, becoming more tolerant of intellectual depth. It caused an increase in the already high demand for scientists on Wall Street, owing to the rapid development of financial instruments. The dominant specialty was physics, but one could find all manner of quantitative backgrounds among them. Russian, French, Chinese, and Indian accents, by order, began dominating in both New York and London. It was said that every plane from Moscow had at least its back row full of Russian mathematical physicists en route to Wall Street. They lacked the street smarts to get good seats. One could hire very cheap labor by going to JFK Airport with a mandatory translator, randomly interviewing those who fit the stereotype. Indeed, by the late 1990s, one could get someone trained by a world-class scientist for almost half the price of an MBA. As they say, marketing is everything. These guys do not know how to sell themselves. I had a strong bias in favor of Russian scientists. Many can be put to active use as chess coaches. I also got a piano teacher out of the process. In addition, they are extremely helpful in the interview process. When MBAs apply for trading positions, they frequently boast advanced chess skills on their resumes. I recall the MBA career counselor at Wharton recommending our advertising chess skills, because it sounds intelligent and strategic. MBAs typically can interpret their superficial knowledge of the rules of the game into expertise. We used to verify the accuracy of claims of chess expertise and the character of the applicant by pulling a chess set out of a drawer and telling the student, now turning pale, "Yuri will have a word with you." The failure rate of these scientists, though, was better, but only slightly so, than that of MBAs. But it came from another reason, linked to their being on average, but only on average, devoid of the smallest bit of practical intelligence. Some successful scientists had the judgment and social graces of a doorknob, but by no means all of them. Many people were capable of the most complex calculations with utmost rigor when it came to equations, but were totally incapable of solving a problem with the smallest connection to reality. It was as if they understood the letter, but not the spirit of the math. We will see more on such dual thinking with the two systems of reasoning problem in Chapter 11. I am convinced that X, a likable Russian man of my acquaintance, had two brains, one for math, and another, considerably inferior one, for everything else, which included solving problems related to the mathematics of finance. But on occasion, a fast-thinking, scientific-minded person with street smarts would emerge. Whatever the benefits of such population shift, it improved our chess skills and provided us with quality conversation during lunchtime. It extended the lunch hour considerably. Consider that I had, in the 1980s, to chat with colleagues who had an MBA or tax accounting background and were capable of the heroic feat of discussing FASB standards. I have to say that their interests were not too contagious. The interesting thing about these physicists did not lie in their ability to discuss fluid dynamics. It is that they were naturally interested in a variety of intellectual subjects and provided pleasant conversation. Solon visits Regine's nightclub. As the reader may already suspect, my opinions about randomness have not earned me the smoothest of relations with some of my peers during my Wall Street career, many of whom the reader can see indirectly, but only indirectly, portrayed in these chapters. But where I had uneven relations was with some of those who had the misfortune of being my bosses. For I had two bosses in my life, of contrasting characteristics in about every trait. The first, whom I will call Kenny, was the epitome of the suburban family man. He would be of the type to coach soccer on Saturday morning and invite his brother-in-law for a Sunday afternoon barbecue. He gave the appearance of someone I would trust with my savings. Indeed, he rose quite rapidly in the institution in spite of his lack of technical competence in financial derivatives, his firm's claim to fame. But he was too much a no-nonsense person to make up my logic. He once blamed me for not being impressed with the successes of some of his traders, who did well during the bull market for European bonds of 1993, whom I openly considered nothing better than random gunslingers. I tried presenting him with the notion of survivorship bias, part 2 of this book, in vain. His traders have all exited the business since then, to pursue other interests, including him. But he gave the appearance of being a calm, measured man who spoke his mind and knew how to put the other person at ease during a conversation. He was articulate, extremely presentable thanks to his athletic looks, well-measured in his speech, and endowed with the extremely rare quality of being an excellent listener. His personal charm allowed him to win the confidence of the chairman, but I could not conceal my disrespect, particularly as he could not make out the nature of my conversation. In spite of his conservative looks, he was a perfect time bomb, ticking away. The second, whom I will call Jean Patrice, in contrast, was a moody Frenchman with an explosive temper and a hyper-aggressive personality. Except for those he truly liked, not that many, he was expert at making his subordinates feel uncomfortable, putting them in a state of constant anxiety. He greatly contributed to my formation as a risk-taker. He is one of the very rare people who have the guts to care only about the generator, entirely oblivious of the results. He presented the wisdom of Solon, but while one would expect someone with such personal wisdom and such understanding of randomness to lead a dull life, he lived a colorful one. In contrast with Kenny, who wore conservative dark suits and white shirts, his only indulgence was flashy equestrian Hermès ties. Jean Patrice dressed like a peacock. Blue shirts, plaid sports coats stuffed with gaudy silk pocket squares. No family-minded man, he rarely came to work before noon, though I can safely say that he carried his work with him to the most unlikely places. He frequently called me from Regine's, an upscale nightclub in New York, waking me up at 3 a.m. to discuss some small and irrelevant details of my risk exposure. In spite of his slight corpulence, women seemed to find him irresistible. He frequently disappeared at midday and was unreachable for hours. His advantage might have been in his being a New York Frenchman with steady bathing habits. Once he invited me to discuss an urgent business issue with him. Characteristically, I found him mid-afternoon in a strange club in Paris that carried no nameplate, and where he sat with documents strewn across the table from him. Sipping champagne, he was simultaneously caressed by two scantily dressed young ladies. Strangely, he involved them in the conversation, as if they were part of the meeting. He even had one of the ladies pick up his constantly ringing mobile phone, as he did not want our conversation to be interrupted. I am still amazed at this flamboyant man's obsession with risks, which he constantly played in his head. He literally thought of everything that could possibly happen. He forced me to make an alternative plan should a plane crash into the office building, way before the events of September 2001, and fumed at my answer that the financial condition of his department would be of small interest to me in such circumstances. He had a horrible reputation as a philanderer, a temperamental boss capable of firing someone at a whim. Yet, he listened to me and understood every word I had to say, encouraging me to go the extra mile in my study of randomness. He taught me to look for the invisible risks of blow-up in any portfolio. Not coincidentally, he has an immense respect for science, and an almost fawning deference for scientists. A decade or so after we worked together, he showed up unexpectedly during the defense of my doctoral thesis, smiling from the back of the room. While Kenny knew how to climb the ladder of an institution, reaching a high level in the organization before being forced out, Jean-Patrice did not have such a happy career, a matter that taught me how to beware of mature financial institutions. It can be disturbing for many self-styled bottom-line-oriented people to be questioned about the histories that did not take place, rather than the ones that actually happened. Clearly, to a no-nonsense person of the successful-in-business variety, my language, and I have to reckon some traits of my personality, appears strange and incomprehensible. To my amusement, the argument appears offensive to many. The contrast between Kenny and Jean-Patrice is not a mere coincidence that I happen to witness in a protracted career. Beware the spendthrift, business-wise person. The cemetery of markets is disproportionately well-stocked with the self-styled bottom-line people. In contrast, with their customary masters of the universe demeanor, they suddenly look pale, humble, and hormone-deprived on the way to the personnel office for the customary discussion of the severance agreement. George Will is no Solon on counterintuitive truths. Realism can be punishing. Probabilistic skepticism is worse. It is difficult to go about life wearing probabilistic glasses, as one starts seeing fools of randomness all around, in a variety of situations, obdurate in their perceptional illusion. To start, it is impossible to read a historian's analysis without questioning the inferences. We know that Hannibal and Hitler were mad in their pursuits, as Rome is not today Phoenician-speaking, and Times Square in New York currently exhibits no swastikas. But what of all those generals who were equally foolish, but ended up winning the war, and consequently the esteem of the historical chronicler? It is hard to think of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar as men who won only in the visible history, but who could have suffered defeat in others. If we have heard of them, it is simply because they took considerable risks, along with thousands of others, and happened to win. They were intelligent, courageous, noble at times, had the highest possible obtainable culture in their day, but so did thousands of others who live in the musty footnotes of history. Again, I am not contesting that they won their wars, only the claims concerning the quality of their strategies. My very first impression upon a recent rereading of the Iliad, the first in my adulthood, is that the epic poet did not judge his heroes by the result. Heroes won and lost battles in a manner that was totally independent of their own valor. Their fate depended upon totally external forces, generally the explicit agency of the scheming gods, not devoid of nepotism. Heroes are heroes because they are heroic in behavior, not because they won or lost. Patroclus does not strike us as a hero because of his accomplishments. He was rapidly killed, but because he preferred to die than see Achilles sulking into inaction. Clearly, the epic poets understood invisible histories. Also, later thinkers and poets had more elaborate methods for dealing with randomness, as we will see with Stoicism. Listening to the media, mostly because I am not used to it, can cause me on occasion to jump out of my seat and become emotional in front of the moving image. I grew up with no television, and was in my late 20s when I learned how to operate a TV set. One illustration of a dangerous refusal to consider alternative histories is provided by the interview that media person George Will, a commentator of the extensively commenting variety, conducted with Professor Robert Schiller, a man known to the public for his best-selling book, Irrational Exuberance, but known to the connoisseur for his remarkable insights about the structure of market randomness and volatility, expressed in the precision of mathematics. The interview is illustrative of the destructive aspect of the media in catering to our heavily warped common sense and biases. I was told that George Will was very famous and extremely respected, that is, for a journalist. He might even be someone of the utmost intellectual integrity. His profession, however, is merely to sound smart and intelligent to the hordes. Schiller, on the other hand, understands the ins and outs of randomness. He is trained to deal with rigorous argumentation, but does sound less smart in public because his subject matter is highly counterintuitive. Schiller had been pronouncing the stock market to be overpriced for a long time. George Will indicated to Schiller that had people listened to him in the past, they would have lost money, as the market has more than doubled since he started pronouncing it overvalued. To such a journalistic and well-sounding, but senseless, argument, Schiller was unable to respond except to explain that the fact that he was wrong in one single market call should not carry undue significance. Schiller, as a scientist, did not claim to be a prophet or one of the entertainers who comment on the markets on the evening news. Yogi Berra would have had a better time with his confident comment on the fat lady not having sung yet. I could not understand what Schiller, untrained to compress his ideas into vapid sound bites, was doing on such a TV show. Clearly, it is foolish to think that an irrational market cannot become even more irrational. Schiller's views on the rationality of the market are not invalidated by the argument that he was wrong in the past. Here I could not help seeing in the person of George Will the representative of so many nightmares in my career. My attempting to prevent someone from playing Russian roulette for $10 million, and seeing journalist George Will humiliating me in public by saying that had the person listened to me, it would have cost him a considerable fortune. In addition, Will's comment was not an off-the-cuff remark. He wrote an article on the matter discussing Schiller's bad prophecy. Such tendency to make and unmake profits based on the fate of the roulette wheel is symptomatic of our ingrained inability to cope with the complex structure of randomness prevailing in the modern world. Mixing forecast and prophecy is symptomatic of randomness, foolishness. Prophecy belongs to the right column, forecast is its mere left column equivalent. Humiliated in debates. Clearly, this idea of alternative history does not make intuitive sense, which is where the fun begins. For starters, we are not wired in a way to understand probability, a point that we will examine backward and forward in this book. I will just say at this point that researchers of the brain believe that mathematical truths make little sense to our mind, particularly when it comes to the examination of random outcomes. Most results in probability are entirely counterintuitive. We will see plenty of them. Then why argue with a mere journalist whose paycheck comes from playing on the conventional wisdom of the hordes? I recall that every time I have been humiliated in a public discussion on markets by someone, of the George Will variety, who seemed to present more palatable and easier to understand arguments, I turned out, much later, to be right. I do not dispute that arguments should be simplified to their maximum potential, but people often confuse complex ideas that cannot be simplified into a media-friendly statement as symptomatic of a confused mind. MBAs learn the concept of clarity and simplicity, the 5-minute manager take on things. The concept may apply to the business plan for a fertilizer plant, but not to highly probabilistic arguments, which is the reason I have anecdotal evidence in my business that MBAs tend to blow up in financial markets as they are trained to simplify matters a couple of steps beyond their requirement. I beg the MBA reader not to take offense. I am myself the unhappy holder of the degree. A different kind of earthquake. Try the following experiment. Go to the airport and ask travelers en route to some remote destination how much they would pay for an insurance policy paying, say, 1 million turgrits, the currency of Mongolia, if they died during the trip, for any reason. Then ask another collection of travelers how much they would pay for insurance that pays the same in the event of death from a terrorist act, and only a terrorist act. Guess which one would command a higher price. Odds are that people would rather pay for the second policy, although the former includes death from terrorism. The psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky figured this out decades ago. The irony is that one of the sampled populations did not include people on the street, but professional predictors attending some Society of Forecasters annual meeting. In a now famous experiment, they found that the majority of people, whether predictors or non-predictors, will judge a deadly flood, causing thousands of deaths, caused by a California earthquake, to be more likely than a fatal flood, causing thousands of deaths, occurring somewhere in North America, which happens to include California. As a derivatives trader, I notice that people do not like to insure against something abstract. The risk that merits their attention is always something vivid. This brings us to a more dangerous dimension of journalism. We just saw how the scientifically hideous George Will and his colleagues can twist arguments to sound right without being right. But there is a more general impact by information providers in biasing the representation of the world one gets from the delivered information. It is a fact that our brain tends to go for superficial clues when it comes to risk and probability, these clues being largely determined by what emotions they elicit or the ease with which they come to mind. In addition to such problems with the perception of risk, it is also a scientific fact, and a shocking one, that both risk detection and risk avoidance are not mediated in the thinking part of the brain, but largely in the emotional one, the risk as feelings theory. The consequences are not trivial. It means that rational thinking has little, very little, to do with risk avoidance. Much of what rational thinking seems to do is rationalize one's actions by fitting some logic to them. In that sense, the description coming from journalism is certainly not just an unrealistic representation of the world, but rather the one that can fool you the most by grabbing your attention via your emotional apparatus, the cheapest to deliver sensation. Take the mad cow threat, for example. Over a decade of hype, it only killed people, in the highest estimates, in the hundreds, as compared to car accidents, several hundred thousands. Except that the journalistic description of the latter would not be commercially fruitful. Note that the risk of dying from food poisoning, or in a car accident on the way to a restaurant, is greater than dying from mad cow disease. This sensationalism can divert empathy toward wrong causes, cancer and malnutrition being the ones that suffer the most from the lack of such attention. Malnutrition in Africa and Southeast Asia no longer causes the emotional impact, so it literally dropped out of the picture. In that sense, the mental probabilistic map in one's mind is so geared toward the sensational that one would realize informational gains by dispensing with the news. Another example concerns the volatility of markets. In people's minds, lower prices are far more volatile than sharply higher moves. In addition, volatility seems to be determined not by the actual moves, but by the tone of the media. The market movements in the 18 months after September 11th, 2001, were far smaller than the ones that we faced in the 18 months prior. But somehow in the mind of investors, they were very volatile. The discussions in the media of the terrorist threats magnified the effect of these market moves in people's heads. This is one of the many reasons that journalism may be the greatest plague we face today. As the world becomes more and more complicated, our minds are trained for more and more simplification. Proverbs galore. Beware the confusion between correctness and intelligibility. Part of conventional wisdom favors things that can be explained rather instantly and in a nutshell. In many circles, it is considered law. Having attended a French elementary school, a lycée primaire, I was trained to rehash Boileau's adage, "What is easy to conceive is clear to express. Words to say it would come effortless." The reader can imagine my disappointment at realizing, while growing up as a practitioner of randomness, that most poetic-sounding adages are plain wrong. Borrowed wisdom can be vicious. I need to make a huge effort not to be swayed by well-sounding remarks. I remind myself of Einstein's remark, that common sense is nothing but a collection of misconceptions, acquired by age 18. Furthermore, what sounds intelligent in a conversation or a meeting, or particularly in the media, is suspicious. Any reading of the history of science would show that almost all the smart things that have been proven by science appeared like lunacies at the time they were first discovered. Try to explain to a Times of London journalist in 1905 that time slows down when one travels. Even the Nobel Committee never granted Einstein the prize on account of his insight on special relativity. Or to someone with no exposure to physics that there are places in our universe where time does not exist. Try to explain to Kenny that, although his Star Trader proved to be extremely successful, I have enough arguments to convince him that he is a dangerous idiot. Risk managers. Corporations and financial institutions have recently created the strange position of risk manager, someone who is supposed to monitor the institution and verify that it is not too deeply involved in the business of playing Russian roulette. Clearly, having been burned a few times, the incentive is there to have someone take a look at the generator, the roulette that produces the profits and losses. Although it is more fun to trade, many extremely smart people among my friends, including Jean-Patrice, felt attracted by such positions. It is an important and attractive fact that the average risk manager earns more than the average trader, particularly when we take into account the number of traders thrown out of the business. While a 10-year survival rate for a trader is in the single digits, that of a risk manager is close to 100%. Traders come and go. Risk managers are here to stay. I keep thinking of taking such a position both on economic grounds, as it is probabilistically more profitable, and because the job offers more intellectual content than the one consisting in just buying and selling, and allows one to integrate research and execution. Finally, a risk manager's blood has smaller quantities of the harmful kind of stress hormones. But something has held me back, aside from the irrationality of wanting the pains and entertainment from the emotions of speculation. The risk manager's job feels strange. As we said, the generator of reality is not observable. They are limited in their power to stop profitable traders from taking risks, given that they would, ex post, be accused by the George Wills around of costing the shareholder some precious opportunity shekels. On the other hand, the occurrence of a blow-up would cause them to be responsible for it. What to do in such circumstances? Their focus becomes to play politics, cover themselves by issuing vaguely phrased internal memoranda that warn against risk-taking activities, yet stop short of completely condemning it, lest they lose their job. Like a doctor torn between the two types of errors, the false positive, telling the patient that he has cancer when in fact he does not, and the false negative, telling the patient he is healthy when in fact he has cancer, they need to balance their existence with the fact that they inherently need some margin of error in their business. Epiphenomena. From the standpoint of an institution, the existence of a risk manager has less to do with actual risk reduction than it has to do with the impression of risk reduction. Philosophers since Hume and modern psychologists have been studying the concept of epiphenomenalism, or when one has the illusion of cause and effect. Does the compass move the boat? By watching your risks, are you effectively reducing them, or are you giving yourself the feeling that you are doing your duty? Are you like a chief executive officer, or just an observing press officer? Is such illusion of control harmful? I conclude the chapter with a presentation of the central paradox of my career in financial randomness. By definition, I go against the grain, so it should come as no surprise that my style and methods are neither popular nor easy to understand. But I have a dilemma. On the one hand, I work with others in the real world, and the real world is not just populated with babbling but ultimately inconsequential journalists. So my wish is for people in general to remain fools of randomness, so I can trade against them. Yet for there to remain a minority intelligent enough to value my methods and hire my services. In other words, I need people to remain fools of randomness, but not all of them. I was fortunate to meet Donald Sussman, who corresponds to such an ideal partner. He helped me in the second stage of my career by freeing me from the ills of employment. My greatest risk is to become successful, as it would mean that my business is about to disappear. Strange business, ours. Chapter 3. A Mathematical Meditation on History. On Monte Carlo simulation as a metaphor for understanding a sequence of random historical events. On randomness and artificial history. Age is beauty, almost always, and the new and the young are generally toxic. Send your history professor to an introductory class on sampling theory. Euro Playboy Mathematics. The stereotype of a pure mathematician presents an anemic man with a shaggy beard and grimy and uncut fingernails, silently laboring on a Spartan but disorganized desk. With thin shoulders and a pot belly, he sits in a grubby office, totally absorbed in his work, oblivious to the grunginess of his surroundings. He grew up in a communist regime and speaks English with an astringent and throaty Eastern European accent. When he eats, crumbs of food accumulate in his beard. With time he becomes more and more absorbed in his subject matter of pure theorems, reaching levels of ever-increasing abstraction. The American public was recently exposed to one of these characters with the Unabomber, the bearded and recluse mathematician who lived in a hut and took to murdering people who promoted modern technology. No journalist was capable of even coming close to describing the subject matter of his thesis, Complex Boundaries, as it has no intelligible equivalent. A complex number being an entirely abstract and imaginary number that includes the square root of -1, an object that has no analog outside of the world of mathematics. The name Monte Carlo conjures up the image of a suntanned, urbane man of the Euro Playboy variety entering a casino under a whiff of the Mediterranean breeze. He is an apt skier and tennis player. but also can hold his own in chess and bridge. He drives a gray sports car, dresses in a well-ironed Italian handmade suit, and speaks carefully and smoothly about mundane but real matters, those a journalist can easily describe to the public in compact sentences. Inside the casino, he astutely counts the cards, mastering the odds, and bets in a studied manner, his mind producing precise calculations of his optimal betting size. He could be James Bond's smarter lost brother. Now, when I think of Monte Carlo mathematics, I think of a happy combination of the two. The Monte Carlo man's realism, without the shallowness, combined with the mathematician's intuitions, without the excessive abstraction. For indeed, this branch of mathematics is of immense practical use. It does not present the same dryness commonly associated with mathematics. I became addicted to it the minute I became a trader. It shaped my thinking in most matters related to randomness. Most of the examples used in this book were created with my Monte Carlo generator, which I introduce in this chapter. Yet it is far more a way of thinking than a computational method. Mathematics is principally a tool to meditate, rather than to compute. The tools. The notion of alternative histories discussed in the last chapter can be extended considerably and subjected to all manner of technical refinement. This brings us to the tools used in my profession to toy with uncertainty. I will outline them next. Monte Carlo methods, in brief, consist of creating artificial history using the following concepts. First, consider the sample path. The invisible histories have a scientific name, alternative sample paths, a name borrowed from the field of mathematics of probability called stochastic processes. The notion of path, as opposed to outcome, indicates that it is not a mere MBA-style scenario analysis, but the examination of a sequence of scenarios along the course of time. We are not just concerned with where a bird can end up tomorrow night, but rather with all the various places it can possibly visit during the time interval. We are not concerned with what the investor's worth would be in, say, a year, but rather of the heart-wrenching rides he may experience during that period. The word sample stresses that one sees only one realization among a collection of possible ones. Now, a sample path can be either deterministic or random, which brings the next distinction. A random sample path, also called a random run, is the mathematical name for such a succession of virtual historical events, starting at a given date and ending at another, except that they are subjected to some varying level of uncertainty. However, the word random should not be mistaken for equiprobable, i.e., having the same probability. Some outcomes will give a higher probability than others. An example of a random sample path can be the body temperature of your explorer cousin during his latest bout with typhoid fever, measured hourly from the beginning to the end of his episode. It can also be a simulation of the price of your favorite technology stock, measured daily at the close of the market over, say, 1 year. Starting at $100, in one scenario, it can end up at $20, having seen a high of $220. In another, it can end up at $145, having seen a low of $10. Another example is the evolution of your wealth during an evening at a casino. You start with $1,000 in your pocket and measure it every 15 minutes. In one sample path, you have $2,200 at midnight. In another, you barely have $20 left for a cab fare. Stochastic processes refer to the dynamics of events unfolding with the course of time. Stochastic is a fancy Greek name for random. This branch of probability concerns itself with the study of the evolution of successive random events. One could call it the mathematics of history. The key about a process is that it has time in it. What is a Monte Carlo generator? Imagine that you can replicate a perfect roulette wheel in your attic without having recourse to a carpenter. Computer programs can be written to simulate just about anything. They are even better and cheaper than the roulette wheel built by your carpenter, as this physical version may be inclined to favor one number more than others, owing to a possible slant in its build or the floor of your attic. These are called biases. Monte Carlo simulations are closer to a toy than anything I have seen in my adult life. One can generate thousands, perhaps millions, of random sample paths, and look at the prevalent characteristic of some of their features. The assistance of the computer is instrumental in such studies. The glamorous reference to Monte Carlo indicates the metaphor of simulating the random events in the manner of a virtual casino. One sets conditions believed to resemble the ones that prevail in reality, and launches a collection of simulations around possible events. With no mathematical literacy, we can launch a Monte Carlo simulation of an 18-year-old Christian Lebanese successively playing Russian roulette for a given sum, and see how many of these attempts result in enrichment, or how long it takes on average before he hits the obituary. We can change the barrel to contain 500 holes, a matter that would decrease the probability of death, and see the results. Monte Carlo simulation methods were pioneered in Marshall Physics in the Los Alamos laboratory during the A-bomb preparation. They became popular in financial mathematics in the 1980s, particularly in the theories of the random walk of asset prices. Clearly, we have to say that the example of Russian roulette does not need such apparatus, but many problems, particularly those resembling real-life situations, require the potency of a Monte Carlo simulator. Monte Carlo mathematics. It is a fact that true mathematicians do not like Monte Carlo methods. They believe that they rob us of the finesse and elegance of mathematics. They call it brute force. For we can replace a large portion of mathematical knowledge with a Monte Carlo simulator and other computational tricks. For instance, someone with no formal knowledge of geometry can compute the mysterious, almost mystical, pi. How? By drawing a circle inside of a square and shooting random bullets into the picture, as in an arcade, specifying equal probabilities of hitting any point on the map, something called a uniform distribution. The ratio of bullets inside the circle divided by those inside and outside the circle will deliver a multiple of the mystical pi, with possibly infinite precision. Clearly, this is not an efficient use of a computer, as pi can be computed analytically, that is, in a mathematical form, but the method can give some users more intuition about the subject matter than lines of equations. Some people's brains and intuitions are oriented in such a way that they are more capable of getting a point in such a manner. I count myself one of those. The computer might not be natural to our human brain. Neither is mathematics. I am not a native mathematician. That is, I am someone who does not speak mathematics as a native language, but someone who speaks it with a trace of a foreign accent. For I am not interested in mathematical properties per se, only in the application, while a mathematician would be interested in improving mathematics via theorems and proofs. I proved incapable of concentrating on deciphering a single equation unless I was motivated by a real problem, with a modicum of greed. Thus, most of what I know comes from derivatives trading. Options pushed me to study the math of probability. Many compulsive gamblers, who otherwise would be of middling intelligence, acquire remarkable card-counting skills thanks to their passionate greed. Another analogy would be with grammar. Mathematics is often tedious and in sightless grammar. There are those who are interested in grammar for grammar's sake, and those interested in avoiding solecisms while writing documents. Those of us in the second category are called quants. Like physicists, we have more interest in the employment of the mathematical tool than in the tool itself. Mathematicians are born, never made. Physicists and quants, too. I do not care about the elegance and quality of the mathematics I use so long as I can get the point right. I have recourse to Monte Carlo machines whenever I can. They can get the work done. They are also far more pedagogical, and I will use them in this book for the examples. Indeed, probability is an introspective field of inquiry, as it affects more than one science, particularly the mother of all sciences, that of knowledge. It is impossible to assess the quality of the knowledge we are gathering without allowing a share of randomness in the manner it is obtained, and cleaning the argument from the chance coincidence that could have seeped into its construction. In science, probability and information are treated in exactly the same manner. Literally, every great thinker has dabbled with it, most of them obsessively. The two greatest minds, to me, Einstein and Keynes, both started their intellectual inquiries with it. Einstein wrote a major paper in 1905, in which he was almost the first to examine in probabilistic terms the succession of random events, namely, the evolution of suspended particles in a stationary liquid. His article on the theory of the Brownian movement can be used as the backbone of the random walk approach used in financial modeling. As for Keynes, to the literate person he is not the political economist the tweed-clad leftists love to quote, but the author of the magisterial, introspective, and potent treatise on probability. For before his venturing into the murky field of political economy, Keynes was a probabilist. He also had other interesting attributes. He blew up trading his account after experiencing excessive opulence. People's understanding of probability does not translate into their behavior. The reader can guess that the next step from such probabilistic introspection is to get drawn into philosophy, particularly the branch of philosophy that concerns itself with knowledge, called epistemology, or methodology, or philosophy of science. We will not get into the topic until later in the book. Fun in my attic. Making history. In the early 1990s, like many of my friends in quantitative finance, I became addicted to the various Monte Carlo engines, which I taught myself to build, thrilled to feel that I was generating history, a demiurgus. It can be electrifying to generate virtual histories and watch the dispersion between the various results. The dispersion is indicative of the degree of resistance to randomness. This is where I am convinced that I have been extremely lucky in my choice of career. One of the attractive aspects of my profession as a quantitative option trader is that I have close to 95% of my day free to think, read, and research, or reflect in the gym, on ski slopes, or, more effectively, on a park bench. I also have the privilege of frequently working from my well-equipped attic. The dividend of the computer revolution to us did not come in the flooding of self-perpetuating email messages and access to chat rooms. It was in the sudden availability of fast processors, capable of generating 1 million sample paths per minute. Recall that I never considered myself better than an unenthusiastic equation solver, and was rarely capable of prowess in the matter, being better at setting up equations than solving them. Suddenly, my engine allowed me to solve with minimal effort the most intractable of equations. Few solutions became out of reach. Zorglubs crowding the attic. My Monte Carlo engine took me on a few interesting adventures. While my colleagues were immersed in news stories, central bank announcements, earnings reports, economic forecasts, sports results, and, not least, office politics, I started toying with it in fields bordering my home base of financial probability. The natural field of expansion for the amateur is evolutionary biology. The universality of its message and its application to markets are appealing. I started simulating populations of fast-mutating animals called zorglubs under climate changes, and witnessing the most unexpected of conclusions. Some of the results are recycled in Chapter 5. My aim, as a pure amateur fleeing the boredom of business life, was merely to develop intuitions for these events. The sort of intuitions that amateurs build away from the overly detailed sophistication of the professional researcher. I also toyed with molecular biology, generating randomly occurring cancer cells and witnessing some surprising aspects of their evolution. Naturally, the analog to fabricating populations of Zorglubs was to simulate a population of idiotic bull, impetuous bear, and cautious traders under different market regimes, say booms and busts, and to examine their short-term and long-term survival. Under such a structure, idiotic bull traders who get rich from the rally would use the proceeds to buy more assets, driving prices higher until their ultimate shellacking. Bearish traders, though, rarely made it in the boom to get to the bust. My models showed that ultimately almost nobody really survived. Bears dropped out like flies in the rally, and bulls ended up being slaughtered, as paper profits vanished when the music stopped. But there was one exception. Some of those who traded options, I called them option buyers, had remarkable staying power, and I wanted to be one of those. Why? Because they could buy the insurance against blow-up. They could get anxiety-free sleep at night, thanks to the knowledge that if their careers were threatened, it would not be owing to the outcome of a single day. If the tone of this book seems steeped in the culture of Darwinism and evolutionary thinking, it does not come from any remotely formal training in the natural sciences, but from the evolutionary way of thinking taught by my Monte Carlo simulators. I reckon that I outgrew the desire to generate random runs every time I want to explore an idea, but by dint of playing with a Monte Carlo engine for years, I can no longer visualize a realized outcome without reference to the non-realized ones. I call that summing under histories, borrowing the expression from the colorful physicist Richard Feynman, who applied such methods to examine the dynamics of subatomic particles. Using my Monte Carlo to make and remake history reminded me of the experimental novels, the so-called new novels, by such writers as Alain Robbe-Grillet, popular in the 1960s and 1970s. There, the same chapter would be written and revised, the writer each time changing the plot, like a new sample path. Somehow the author was freed from the past situation he helped create and allowed himself the indulgence to change the plot retroactively. Denigration of history. One more word on history seen from a Monte Carlo perspective. The wisdom of such classical stories as Solon's prods me to spend even more time in the company of the classical historians, even if the stories, like Solon's warning, have benefited from the patina of time. However, this goes against the grain. Learning from history does not come naturally to us humans, a fact that is so visible in the endless repetitions of identically confirmed booms and busts in modern markets. By history, I refer to the anecdotes, not the historical theorizing, the grand-scale historicism that aims to interpret events with theories based on uncovering some laws in the evolution of history, the sort of Hegelianism and pseudo-scientific historicism leading to such calls as the end of history. It is pseudo-scientific because it draws theories from past events without allowing for the fact that such combinations of events might have arisen from randomness. There is no way to verify the claims in a controlled experiment. For me, history is of use merely at the level of my desired sensibility, affecting the way I would wish to think by reference to past events, by being able to better steal the ideas of others and leverage them, correct the mental defect that seems to block my ability to learn from others. It is the respect of the elders that I would like to develop, reinforcing the awe I instinctively feel for people with gray hair, but that has eroded in my life as a trader, where age and success are somewhat divorced. Indeed, I have two ways of learning from history: from the past, by reading the elders, and from the future, thanks to my Monte Carlo toy. The stove is hot. As I mentioned before, it is not natural for us to learn from history. We have enough clues to believe that our human endowment does not favor transfers of experience in a cultural way, but through selection of those who bear some favorable traits. It is a platitude that children learn only from their own mistakes. They will cease to touch a burning stove only when they are themselves burned. No possible warning by others can lead to developing the smallest form of cautiousness. Adults, too, suffer from such a condition. This point has been examined by behavioral economics pioneers Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky with regard to the choices people make in selecting risky medical treatments. I myself have seen it in my being extremely lax in the area of detection and prevention, i.e., I refuse to derive my risks from the probabilities computed on others, feeling that I am somewhat special, yet extremely aggressive in the treatment of medical conditions. I overreact when I am burned, which is not coherent with rational behavior under uncertainty. This congenital denigration of the experience of others is not limited to children or to people like myself. It affects business decision-makers and investors on a grand scale. If you think that merely reading history books would help you learn from others' mistakes, consider the following 19th-century experiment. In a well-known psychology case, the Swiss Dr. Claparède had an amnesic patient completely crippled with her ailment. Her condition was so bad that he would have to reintroduce himself to her at a frequency of once per 15 minutes for her to remember who he was. One day he secreted a pin in his hand before shaking hers. The next day she quickly withdrew her hand as he tried to greet her, but still did not recognize him. Since then, plenty of discussions of amnesic patients show some form of learning on the part of people without their being aware of it, and without it being stored in conscious memory. The scientific name of the distinction between the two memories, the conscious and the non-conscious, is declarative and non-declarative. Much of the risk avoidance that comes from experiences is part of the second. The only way I developed a respect for history is by making myself aware of the fact that I was not programmed to learn from it in a textbook format. Actually, things can be worse than that. In some respects, we do not learn from our own history. Several branches of research have been examining our inability to learn from our own reactions to past events. For example, people fail to learn that their emotional reactions to past experiences, positive or negative, were short-lived, yet they continuously retain the bias of thinking that the purchase of an object will bring long-lasting, possibly permanent happiness, or that a setback will cause severe and prolonged distress, when in the past similar setbacks did not affect them for very long, and the joy of the purchase was short-lived. All of my colleagues who I have known to denigrate history blew up spectacularly, and I have yet to encounter some such person who has not blown up. But the truly interesting point lies in the remarkable similarities in their approaches. The blow-up, I will repeat, is different from merely incurring a monetary loss. It is losing money when one does not believe that such fact is possible at all. There is nothing wrong with a risk-taker taking a hit, provided one declares that one is a risk-taker rather than that the risk being taken is small or non-existent. Characteristically, blown-up traders think that they knew enough about the world to reject the possibility of the adverse event taking place. There was no courage in their taking such risks, just ignorance. I have noticed plenty of the analogies between those who blew up in the stock market crash of 1987, those who blew up in the Japan meltdown of 1990, those who blew up in the bond market debacle of 1994, those who blew up in Russia in 1998, and those who blew up shorting NASDAQ stocks. They all made claims to the effect that these times are different, or that their market was different, and offered seemingly well-constructed, intellectual arguments of an economic nature to justify their claims. They were unable to accept that the experience of others was out there, in the open, freely available to all, with books detailing crashes in every bookstore. Aside from these generalized, systemic blow-ups, I have seen hundreds of option traders forced to leave the business after blowing up in a stupid manner, in spite of warnings by the veterans, similar to a child's touching the stove. This I find to resemble my own personal attitude with respect to the detection and prevention of the variety of ailments I may be subjected to. Every man believes himself to be quite different, a matter that amplifies the "why me" shock upon a diagnosis. Skills in predicting past history. We can discuss this point from different angles. Experts call one manifestation of such denigration of history historical determinism. In a nutshell, we think that we would know when history is made. We believe that people who, say, witnessed the stock market crash of 1929 knew then that they lived an acute historical event, and that, should these events repeat themselves, they too would know about such facts. Life for us is made to resemble an adventure movie, as we know ahead of time that something big is about to happen. It is hard to imagine that people who witnessed history did not know, at the time, how important the moment was. Somehow all respect we may have for history does not translate well into our treatment of the present. Jean Patrice of the last chapter was abruptly replaced by an interesting civil servant type who had never been involved in the randomness professions. He just went to the right civil servant schools, where people learned to write reports, and had some senior managerial position in the institution. As is typical with subjectively assessed positions, he tried to make his predecessor look bad. Jean Patrice was deemed sloppy and unprofessional. The civil servant's first undertaking was to run a formal analysis of our transactions. He found that we traded a little too much, incurring very large back-office expenditure. He analyzed a large segment of foreign exchange traders' transactions, then wrote a report explaining that only close to 1% of these transactions generated significant profits. The rest generated either losses or small profits. He was shocked that the traders did not do more of the winners and less of the losers. It was obvious to him that we needed to comply with these instructions immediately. If we just doubled the winners, the results for the institution would be so great. How come you highly paid traders did not think about it before? Things are always obvious after the fact. The civil servant was a very intelligent person, and this mistake is much more prevalent than one would think. It has to do with the way our mind handles historical information. When you look at the past will always be deterministic, since only one single observation took place. Our mind will interpret most events, not with the preceding ones in mind, but the following ones. Imagine taking a test, knowing the answer. While we know that history flows forward, it is difficult to realize that we envision it backward. Why is it so? We will discuss the point in Chapter 11, but here is a possible explanation. Our minds are not quite designed to understand how the world works, but rather to get out of trouble rapidly and have progeny. If they were made for us to understand things, then we would have a machine in it that would run the past history as in a VCR, with a correct chronology, and it would slow us down so much that we would have trouble operating. Psychologists call this overestimation of what one knew at the time of the event due to subsequent information the hindsight bias, the "I knew it all along" effect. Now, the civil servant called the trades that ended up as losers gross mistakes, just like journalists call decisions that end up costing a candidate his election a mistake. I will repeat this point until I get hoarse. A mistake is not something to be determined after the fact, but in the light of the information until that point. A more vicious effect of such hindsight bias is that those who are very good at predicting the past will think of themselves as good at predicting the future, and feel confident about their ability to do so. This is why events like those of September 11th, 2001, never teach us that we live in a world where important events are not predictable. Even the Twin Towers collapse appears to have been predictable then. My Solon. I have another reason to be obsessed with Solon's warning. I hark back to the very same strip of land in the eastern Mediterranean where the story took place. My ancestors experienced bouts of extreme opulence and embarrassing penury over the course of a single generation, with abrupt regressions that people around me who have the memory of steady and linear betterment do not think feasible. Those around me either have, so far, had few family setbacks, except for the Great Depression, or more generally, are not suffused with enough sense of history to reflect backward. For people of my background, Eastern Mediterranean Greek Orthodox, and invaded Eastern Roman citizens, it was as if our soul had been wired with the remembrance of that sad spring day circa 500 years ago, when Constantinople, under the invading Turks, fell out of history, leaving us the lost subjects of a dead empire, very prosperous minorities in an Islamic world, but with an extremely fragile wealth. Moreover, I vividly remember the image of my own dignified grandfather, a former deputy prime minister and son of a deputy prime minister, whom I never saw without a suit, residing in a nondescript apartment in Athens, his estate having been blown up during the Lebanese Civil War. Incidentally, having experienced the ravages of war, I find undignified impoverishment far harsher than physical danger. Somehow dying in full dignity appears to me far preferable to living a janitorial life, which is one of the reasons I dislike financial risks far more than physical ones. I am certain that Croesus worried more about the loss of his kingdom than the perils to his life. There is an important and non-trivial aspect of historical thinking, perhaps more applicable to the markets than anything else. Unlike many hard sciences, history cannot lend itself to experimentation. But somehow, overall, history is potent enough to deliver, on time, in the medium to long run, most of the possible scenarios, and to eventually bury the bad guy. Bad trades catch up with you, it is frequently said in the markets. Mathematicians of probability give that a fancy name, ergodicity. It means, roughly, that under certain conditions, very long sample paths would end up resembling each other. The properties of a very, very long sample path would be similar to the Monte Carlo properties of an average of shorter ones. The janitor, in Chapter 1, who won the lottery, if he lived 1,000 years, cannot be expected to win more lotteries. Those who were unlucky in life in spite of their skills would eventually rise. The lucky fool might have benefited from some luck in life. Over the longer run, he would slowly converge to the state of a less lucky idiot. Each one would revert to his long-term properties. Distilled thinking on your Palm Pilot. Breaking news. The journalist, my bête noire, entered this book with George Will, dealing with random outcomes. In the next step, I will show how my Monte Carlo toy taught me to favor distilled thinking, by which I mean the thinking based on information around us that is stripped of meaningless but diverting clutter. For the difference between noise and information, the topic of this book, Noise Has More Randomness, has an analog, that between journalism and history. To be competent, a journalist should view matters like a historian, and play down the value of the information he is providing, such as by saying, "Today the market went up, but this information is not too relevant as it emanates mostly from noise." He would certainly lose his job by trivializing the value of the information in his hands. Not only is it difficult for the journalist to think more like an historian, but it is, alas, the historian who is becoming more like the journalist. For an idea, age is beauty. It is premature to discuss the mathematics of the point. The applicability of Solon's warning to a life in randomness in contrast with the exact opposite message delivered by the prevailing media-soaked culture, reinforces my instinct to value distilled thought over newer thinking, regardless of its apparent sophistication. Another reason to accumulate the hoary volumes by my bedside. I confess that the only news items I currently read are the far more interesting upscale social gossip stories found in Tatler, Paris Match, and Vanity Fair, in addition to The Economist. Aside from the decorum of ancient thought as opposed to the coarseness of fresh ink, I have spent some time phrasing the idea in the mathematics of evolutionary arguments and conditional probability. For an idea to have survived so long, across so many cycles, is indicative of its relative fitness. Noise, at least some noise, was filtered out. Mathematically, progress means that some new information is better than past information, not that the average of new information will supplant past information, which means that it is optimal for someone, when in doubt, to systematically reject the new idea, information, or method. Clearly and shockingly, always. Why? The argument in favor of new things, and even more new things, goes as follows. Look at the dramatic changes that have been brought about by the arrival of new technologies, such as the automobile, the airplane, the telephone, and the personal computer. Middlebrow inference stripped of probabilistic thinking, would lead one to believe that all new technologies and inventions would likewise revolutionize our lives. But the answer is not so obvious. Here we only see and count the winners, to the exclusion of the losers. It is like saying that actors and writers are rich, ignoring the fact that actors are largely waiters, and lucky to be ones, for the less comely writers usually serve French fries at McDonald's. Losers? The Saturday newspaper lists dozens of new patents for such items that can revolutionize our lives. People tend to infer that because some inventions have revolutionized our lives, that inventions are good to endorse, and we should favor the new over the old. I hold the opposite view. The opportunity cost of missing a new thing, like the airplane and the automobile, is minuscule compared to the toxicity of all the garbage one has to go through to get to these jewels, assuming these have brought some improvement to our lives, which I frequently doubt. Now, the exact same argument applies to information. The problem with information is not that it is diverting and generally useless, but that it is toxic. We will examine the dubious value of the highly frequent news with a more technical discussion of signal filtering and observation frequency farther down. I will say here that such respect for the time-honored provides arguments to rule out any commerce with a babbling modern journalist, and implies a minimal exposure to the media as a guiding principle for someone involved in decision-making under uncertainty. If there is anything better than noise in the mass of urgent news pounding us, it would be like a needle in a haystack. People do not realize that the media is paid to get your attention. For a journalist, silence rarely surpasses any word. On the rare occasions when I boarded the 6:42 train to New York, I observed with amazement the hordes of depressed business commuters, who seemed to prefer to be elsewhere, studiously buried in the Wall Street Journal, apprised of the minutiae of companies that, at the time of writing now, are probably out of business. Indeed, it is difficult to ascertain whether they seem depressed because they are reading the newspaper, or if depressive people tend to read the newspaper, or if people who are living outside their genetic habitat both read the newspaper and look sleepy and depressed. But while early on in my career such focus on noise would have offended me intellectually, as I would have deemed such information too statistically insignificant for the derivation of any meaningful conclusion, I currently look at it with delight. I am happy to see such mass-scale idiotic decision-making prone to overreaction in their post-perusal investment orders. In other words, I currently see in the fact that people read such material an insurance for my continuing in the entertaining business of option trading against the fools of randomness. It takes a huge investment in introspection to learn that the 30 or more hours spent studying the news last month neither had any predictive ability during your activities of that month, nor did it impact your current knowledge of the world. This problem is similar to the weaknesses in our ability to correct for past errors. Like a health club membership taken out to satisfy a New Year's resolution, people often think that it will surely be the next batch of news that will really make a difference to their understanding of things. Schiller Redux. Much of the thinking about the negative value of information on society in general was sparked by Robert Schiller. Not just in financial markets, but overall his 1981 paper may be the first mathematically formulated introspection on the manner in which society in general handles information. Schiller made his mark with his 1981 paper on the volatility of markets, where he determined that if a stock price is the estimated value of something, say the discounted cash flows from a corporation, then market prices are way too volatile in relation to tangible manifestations of that something. He used dividends as proxy. Prices swing more than the fundamentals they are supposed to reflect. They visibly overreact by being too high at times, when their price overshoots the good news, or when they go up without any marked reason, or too low at others. The volatility differential between prices and information meant that something about rational expectation did not work. Prices did not rationally reflect the long-term value of securities and were overshooting in either direction. Markets had to be wrong. Schiller then pronounced markets to be not as efficient as established by financial theory. Efficient markets meant, in a nutshell, that prices should adapt to all available information in such a way as to be totally unpredictable to us humans and prevent people from deriving profits. This conclusion set off calls by the religious orders of high finance for the destruction of the infidel who committed such apostasy. Interestingly, and by some strange coincidence, it is that very same Schiller who was trounced by George Will only one chapter ago. The principal criticism against Schiller came from Robert C. Merton. The attacks were purely on methodological grounds. Schiller's analysis was extremely rough. For instance, his using dividends in place of earnings was rather weak. Merton was also defending the official financial theory position that markets needed to be efficient and could not possibly deliver opportunities on a silver plate. Yet the same Robert C. Merton later introduced himself as the founding partner of a hedge fund that aimed at taking advantage of market inefficiencies. Setting aside the fact that Merton's hedge fund blew up rather spectacularly from the black swan problem, with characteristic denial, his founding such a hedge fund requires by implication that he agrees with Schiller about the inefficiency of the market. The defender of the dogmas of modern finance and efficient markets started a fund that took advantage of market inefficiencies. It is as if the Pope converted to Islam. Things are not getting any better these days. At the time of writing, news providers are offering all manner of updates, breaking news that can be delivered electronically in a wireless manner. The ratio of undistilled information to distilled is rising, saturating markets. The elder's message need not be delivered to you as imminent news. This does not mean that all journalists are fooled by randomness noise providers. There are hordes of thoughtful journalists in the business. I would suggest London's Anatoly Kaletsky, and New York's Jim Grant, and Alan Abelson as the underrated representatives of such a class among financial journalists, Gary Stix among scientific journalists. It is just that prominent media journalism is a thoughtless process of providing the noise that can capture people's attention and there exists no mechanism for separating the two. As a matter of fact, smart journalists are often penalized, like the lawyer in Chapter 11 who does not care about the truth, but about arguments that can sway a jury whose intellectual defects he knows intimately. Journalism goes to what can capture our attention, with adequate sound bites. Again, my scholarly friends would wonder why I'm getting emotional stating the obvious things about the journalists. The problem with my profession is that we depend on them for what information we need to obtain. Gerontocracy. A preference for distilled thinking implies favoring old investors and traders, that is, investors who have been exposed to markets the longest, a matter that is counter to the common Wall Street practice of preferring those that have been the most profitable and preferring the youngest whenever possible. I toyed with Monte Carlo simulations of heterogeneous populations of traders under a variety of regimes, closely resembling historical ones, and found a significant advantage in selecting aged traders, using as a selection criterion their cumulative years of experience rather than their absolute success, conditional on their having survived without blowing up. Survival of the fittest, a term so hackneyed in the investment media, does not seem to be properly understood. Under regime switching, as we will see in Chapter 5, it will be unclear who is actually the fittest, and those who will survive are not necessarily those who appear to be the fittest. Curiously, it will be the oldest, simply because older people have been exposed longer to the rare event and can be, convincingly, more resistant to it. I was amused to discover a similar evolutionary argument in mate selection that considers that women prefer, on balance, to mate with healthy older men over healthy younger ones, everything else being equal, as the former provides some evidence of better genes. Gray hair signals an enhanced ability to survive. Conditional on having reached the gray hair stage, a man is likely to be more resistant to the vagaries of life. Curiously, life insurers in Renaissance Italy reached the same conclusion, by charging the same insurance for a man in his 20s as they did for a man in his 50s, a sign that they had the same life expectancy. Once a man crossed the 40-year mark, he had shown that very few ailments could harm him. We now proceed to a mathematical rephrasing of these arguments. Philostratus in Monte Carlo, on the difference between noise and information. The wise man listens to meaning. The fool only gets the noise. The modern Greek poet C.P. Cavafy wrote a piece in 1915 after Philostratus' adage, "For the gods perceive things in the future, ordinary people things in the present, but the wise perceive things about to happen." Cavafy wrote, "In their intense meditation, the hidden sound of things approaching reaches them, and they listen reverently, while in the street outside the people hear nothing at all." I thought long and hard on how to explain, with as little mathematics as possible, the difference between noise and meaning, and how to show why the timescale is important in judging an historical event. The Monte Carlo simulator can provide us with such an intuition. We will start with an example borrowed from the investment world, as it can be explained rather easily, but the concept can be used in any application. Let us manufacture a happily retired dentist, living in a pleasant sunny town. We know, a priori, that he is an excellent investor, and that he will be expected to earn a return of 15% in excess of Treasury bills, with a 10% error rate per annum, what we call volatility. It means that out of 100 sample paths, we expect close to 68 of them to fall within a band of plus and minus 10%, around the 15% excess return, i.e., between 5% and 25%. To be technical, the bell-shaped normal distribution has 68% of all observations falling between -1 and 1 standard deviations. It also means that the 95 sample paths would fall between -5% and 35%. Clearly, we are dealing with a very optimistic situation. The dentist builds for himself a nice trading desk in his attic, aiming to spend every business day there watching the market, while sipping decaffeinated cappuccino. He has an adventurous temperament, so he finds this activity more attractive than drilling the teeth of reluctant little old Park Avenue ladies. He subscribes to a web-based service that supplies him with continuous prices, now to be obtained for a fraction of what he pays for his coffee. He puts his inventory of securities in his spreadsheet, and can thus instantaneously monitor the value of his speculative portfolio. We are living in the era of connectivity. A 15% return with a 10% volatility or uncertainty per annum translates into a 93% probability of success in any given year. But, seen at a narrow time scale, this translates into a mere 50.02% probability of success over any given second. Here is the probability of success at different scales table. In 1 year, 93% probability. In 1 quarter, 77% probability. 1 month, 67% probability. 1 day, 54% probability. 1 hour, 51.3%. 1 minute, 50.17%. And 1 second, 50.02%. Over the very narrow time increment, the observation will reveal close to nothing. Yet the dentist's heart will not tell him that. Being emotional, he feels a pang with every loss, as it shows in red on his screen. He feels some pleasure when the performance is positive, but not in an equivalent amount as the pain experienced when the performance is negative. At the end of every day, the dentist will be emotionally drained. A minute-by-minute examination of his performance means that each day, assuming 8 hours per day, he will have 241 pleasurable minutes against 239 unpleasurable ones. These amount to 60,688 and 60,271, respectively, per year. Now realize that if the unpleasurable minute is worse in reverse pleasure than the pleasurable minute is in pleasure terms, then the dentist incurs a large deficit when examining his performance at a high frequency. Consider the situation where the dentist examines his portfolio only upon receiving the monthly account from the brokerage house. As 67% of his months will be positive, he incurs only 4 pangs of pain per annum and 8 uplifting experiences. This is the same dentist following the same strategy. Now consider the dentist looking at his performance only every year. Over the next 20 years that he is expected to live, he will experience 19 pleasant surprises for every unpleasant one. This scaling property of randomness is generally misunderstood, even by professionals. I have seen PhDs argue over a performance observed in a narrow time scale, meaningless by any standard. Before additional dumping on the journalist, more observations seem in order. Viewing it from another angle, if we take the ratio of noise to what we call non-noise, i.e., left column versus right column, which we have the privilege here of examining quantitatively, then we have the following. Over 1 year, we observe roughly 0.7 parts noise for every 1 part performance. Over 1 month, we observe roughly 2.32 parts noise for every part performance. Over 1 hour, 30 parts noise for every 1 part performance. And over 1 second, 1,796 parts noise for every 1 part performance. A few conclusions. 1. Over a short time increment, one observes the variability of the portfolio, not the returns. In other words, one sees the variance, little else. I always remind myself that What one observes is at best a combination of variance and returns, not just returns. But my emotions do not care about what I tell myself. 2. Our emotions are not designed to understand the point. The dentist did better when he dealt with monthly statements rather than more frequent ones. Perhaps it would be even better for him if he limited himself to yearly statements. If you think that you can control your emotions, think that some people also believe that they can control their heartbeat or hair growth. And 3. When I see an investor monitoring his portfolio with live prices on his cellular telephone or his handheld, I smile and smile. Finally, I reckon that I am not immune to such an emotional defect, but I deal with it by having no access to information, except in rare circumstances. Again, I prefer to read poetry. If an event is important enough, it will find its way to my ears. I will return to this point in time. The same methodology can explain why the news, the high scale, is full of noise, and why history, the low scale, is largely stripped of it, though fraught with interpretation problems. This explains why I prefer not to read the newspaper, outside of the obituary, why I never chit-chat about markets, and, when in a trading room, I frequent the mathematicians and the secretaries, not the traders. It explains why it is better to read the New Yorker on Mondays than the Wall Street Journal every morning, from the standpoint of frequency, aside from the massive gap in intellectual class between the two publications. Finally, this explains why people who look too closely at randomness burn out, their emotions drained by the series of pangs they experience. Regardless of what people claim, a negative pang is not offset by a positive one. Some psychologists estimate that the negative effect for an average loss to be up to 2.5 the magnitude of a positive one. It will lead to an emotional deficit. Now that you know that the high-frequency dentist has more exposure to both stress and positive pangs, and that these do not cancel out, consider that people in lab coats have examined some scary properties of this type of negative pangs on the neural system. The usual expected effect, high blood pressure. The less expected, chronic stress leads to memory loss, lessening of brain plasticity, and brain damage. To my knowledge, there are no studies investigating the exact properties of traders' burnout, but a daily exposure to such high degrees of randomness without much control will have psychological effects on humans. Nobody studied the effect of such exposure on the risk of cancer. What economists did not understand for a long time about positive and negative kicks is that both their biology and their intensity are different. Consider that they are mediated in different parts of the brain, and that the degree of rationality in decisions made subsequent to a gain is extremely different from the one after a loss. Note also that the implication that wealth does not count so much into one's well-being as the route one uses to get to it. Some so-called wise and rational persons often blame me for ignoring possible valuable information in the daily newspaper and refusing to discount the details of the noise as short-term events. Some of my employers have blamed me for living on a different planet. My problem is that I am not rational, and I am extremely prone to drown in randomness and to incur emotional torture. I am aware of my need to ruminate on park benches and in cafes away from information, but I can only do so if I am somewhat deprived of it. My sole advantage in life is that I know some of my weaknesses, mostly that I am incapable of taming my emotions, facing news, and incapable of seeing a performance with a clear head. Silence is far better. More on that in Part 3. Chapter 4. Randomness, Nonsense, and the Scientific Intellectual. On extending the Monte Carlo generator to produce artificial thinking, and compare it with rigorous non-random constructs. The science wars enter the business world, why the aesthete in me loves to be fooled by randomness. Randomness and the Verb. Our Monte Carlo engine can take us into more literary territory. Increasingly, a distinction is being made between the scientific intellectual and the literary intellectual, culminating with what is called the science wars, plotting factions of literate non-scientists against no less literate scientists. The distinction between the two approaches originated in Vienna in the 1930s, with a collection of physicists who decided that the large gains in science were becoming significant enough to make claims in the field known to belong to the humanities. In their view, literary thinking could conceal plenty of well-sounding nonsense. They wanted to strip thinking from rhetoric, except in literature and poetry, where it properly belonged. The way they introduced rigor into intellectual life is by declaring that a statement could fall into only two categories. Deductive, like 2 + 2 = 4, i.e., incontrovertibly flowing from a precisely defined axiom framework, here the rules of arithmetic, or inductive, i.e., verifiable in some manner, experiences, statistics, etc., like it rains in Spain, or New Yorkers are generally rude. Anything else was plain unadulterated hogwash. Music could be a far better replacement to metaphysics. Needless to say that inductive statements may turn out to be difficult, even impossible to verify, as we will see with the black swan problem. And empiricism can be worse than any other form of hogwash when it gives someone confidence. It will take me a few chapters to drill the point. However, it was a good start to make intellectuals responsible for providing some form of evidence for their statements. This Vienna circle was at the origin of the development of the ideas of Popper, Wittgenstein in his later phase, Carnap, and flocks of others. Whatever merit their original ideas may have, the impact on both philosophy and the practice of science has been significant. Some of their impact on non-philosophical intellectual life is starting to develop, albeit considerably more slowly. One conceivable way to discriminate between a scientific intellectual and a literary intellectual is by considering that a scientific intellectual can usually recognize the writing of another, but that the literary intellectual would not be able to tell the difference between lines jotted down by a scientist and those by a glib non-scientist. This is even more apparent when the literary intellectual starts using scientific buzzwords, like uncertainty principle, Gödel's theorem, parallel universe, or relativity, either out of context or, as often, in exact opposition to the scientific meaning. I suggest reading the hilarious, Fashionable Nonsense by Alan Sokal for an illustration of such practice. I was laughing so loudly and so frequently while reading it on a plane that other passengers kept whispering things about me. By dumping the kitchen sink of scientific references in a paper, one can make another literary intellectual believe that one's material has the stamp of science. Clearly, to a scientist, science lies in the rigor of the inference, not in random references to such grandiose concepts as general relativity or quantum indeterminacy. Such rigor can be spelled out in plain English. Science is method and rigor. It can be identified in the simplest of prose writing. For instance, what struck me while reading Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene is that, although the text does not exhibit a single equation, it seems as if it were translated from the language of mathematics. Yet, it is artistic prose. Reverse Turing Test. Randomness can be of considerable help with the matter, for there is another, far more entertaining way to make the distinction between the babbler and the thinker. You can sometimes replicate something that can be mistaken for a literary discourse with the Monte Carlo generator, but it is not possible, randomly, to construct a scientific one. Rhetoric can be constructed randomly, but not genuine scientific knowledge. This is the application of Turing's test of artificial intelligence, except in reverse. What is the Turing test? The brilliant British mathematician, eccentric and computer pioneer Alan Turing came up with the following test. A computer can be said to be intelligent if it can, on average, fool a human into mistaking it for another human. The converse should be true. A human can be said to be unintelligent if we can replicate his speech by a computer, which we know is unintelligent, and fool a human into believing that it was written by a human. Can one produce a piece of work that can be largely mistaken for Derrida, entirely, randomly? The answer seems to be yes. Aside from the hoax by Alan Sokal, the same of the hilarious book a few moments ago, who managed to produce nonsense and get it published by some prominent journal, there are Monte Carlo generators designed to structure such texts and write entire papers. Fed with postmodernist texts, they can randomize phrases under a method called recursive grammar and produce grammatically sound but entirely meaningless sentences that sound like Jacques Derrida, Camille Paglia, and such a crowd. Owing to the fuzziness of his thought, the literary intellectual can be fooled by randomness. At the Monash University program in Australia, featuring the Dada engine, built by Andrew C. Bullock, I toyed with the engine and generated a few papers containing the following sentences. However, the main theme of the works of Rushdie is not theory, as the dialectic paradigm of reality suggests, but pre-theory. The premise of the neo-semanticist paradigm of discourse implies that sexual identity, ironically, has significance. Many narratives concerning the role of the writer as observer may be revealed. It could be said that if cultural narrative holds, we have to choose between the dialectic paradigm of narrative and neo-conceptual Marxism. Sartre's analysis of cultural narrative holds that society, paradoxically, has objective value. Thus, the premise of the neo-dialectic paradigm of expression implies that consciousness may be used to reinforce hierarchy, but only if reality is distinct from consciousness. If that is not the case, we can assume that language has intrinsic meaning. Some business speeches belong to this category in their own right, except that they are less elegant and drawn on a different type of vocabulary than the literary ones. We can randomly construct a speech imitating that of your chief executive officer to ensure whether what he is saying has value, or if it is merely dressed-up nonsense from someone who is lucky to be put there. How? You select randomly 5 of the following phrases, then connect them by adding the minimum required to construct a grammatically sounding speech. Here they are. We look after our customers' interests. The road ahead. Our assets are our people. Creation of shareholder value. Our vision. Our expertise lies in. We provide interactive solutions. We position ourselves in this market. How to serve our customers better. Short-term pain for long-term gain. We will be rewarded in the long run. We play from our strength and improve our weaknesses. Courage and determination will prevail. We are committed to innovation and technology. A happy employee is a productive employee. Commitment to excellence. Strategic plan. And finally, our work ethics. If this bears too close a resemblance to the speech you just heard from the boss of your company, then I suggest looking for a new job. The father of all pseudo-thinkers. It is hard to resist discussion of artificial history without a comment on the father of all pseudo-thinkers, Hegel. Hegel writes a jargon that is meaningless outside of a chic left-bank Parisian cafe, or the humanities department of some university extremely well insulated from the real world. I suggest this passage from the German philosopher. This passage was detected, translated, and reviled by Karl Popper. Sound is the change in the specific condition of segregation of the material parts, and in the negation of this condition. Merely an abstract, or an ideality, as it were, of that specification. But this change, accordingly, is itself immediately the negation of the material-specific subsistence, which is, therefore, real ideality of a specific gravity and cohesion, i.e., heat. The heating up of sounding bodies, just as of beaten or rubbed ones, is the appearance of heat, originating conceptually together with sound. Even a Monte Carlo engine could not sound as random as the great philosophical master thinker. It would take plenty of sample runs to get the mixture of heat and sound. People call that philosophy and frequently finance it with taxpayer subsidies. Now consider that Hegelian thinking is generally linked to a scientific approach to history. It has produced such results as Marxist regimes, and even a branch called Neo-Hegelian thinking. These thinkers should be given an undergraduate-level class on statistical sampling theory prior to their release into the open world. Monte Carlo poetry. There are instances where I like to be fooled by randomness. My allergy to nonsense and verbiage dissipates when it comes to art and poetry. On the one hand, I try to define myself and behave officially as a no-nonsense, hyper-realist, ferreting out the role of chance. On the other, I have no qualms indulging in all manner of personal superstitions. Where do I draw the line? The answer is aesthetics. Some aesthetic forms appeal to something in our biology, whether or not they originate in random associations or plain hallucination. Something in our human genes is deeply moved by the fuzziness and ambiguity of language. Then why fight it? The poetry and language lover in me was initially depressed by the account of the exquisite cadavers poetic exercise, where interesting and poetic sentences were randomly constructed. By throwing enough words together, some unusual and magical-sounding metaphor is bound to emerge according to the laws of combinatorics. Yet one cannot deny that some of these poems are of ravishing beauty. Who cares about their origin if they manage to please our aesthetic senses? The story of the exquisite cadavers is as follows. In the aftermath of the First World War, a collection of surrealist poets, which included André Breton, their pope, Paul Eluard, and others, got together in cafes and tried the following exercise. Modern literary critics attribute the exercise to the depressed mood after the war and the need to escape reality. On a folded piece of paper, in turn, each one of them would write a predetermined part of a sentence, not knowing the other's choice. The first would pick an adjective, the second a noun, the third a verb, the fourth an adjective, and the fifth a noun. The first publicized exercise of such random and collective arrangement produced the following poetic sentence. The exquisite cadavers shall drink the new wine. Impressive? It sounds even more poetic in the native French. Quite impressive poetry has been produced in such a manner, sometimes with the aid of a computer. But poetry has never been truly taken seriously outside of the beauty of its associations, whether they have been produced by the random ranting of one or more disorganized brains, or the more elaborate constructions of one conscious creator. Now, regardless of whether the poetry was obtained by a Monte Carlo engine or sung by a blind man in Asia Minor, language is potent in bringing pleasure and solace. Testing its intellectual validity by translating it into simple logical arguments would rob it of a varying degree of its potency, sometimes excessively. Nothing can be more bland than translated poetry. A convincing argument of the role of language is the existence of surviving holy languages, uncorrupted by the no-nonsense tests of daily use. Semitic religions, that is, Judaism, Islam, and original Christianity, understood the point. Keep a language away from the rationalization of daily use and avoid the corruption of the vernacular. 4 decades ago, the Catholic Church translated the services and liturgies from Latin to the local vernaculars. One may wonder if this caused a drop in religious beliefs. Suddenly, religion subjected itself to being judged by intellectual and scientific, without the aesthetic, standards. The Greek Orthodox Church made the lucky mistake, upon translating some of its prayers from Church Greek into the Semitic-based vernacular spoken by the Greco-Syrians of the Antioch region, southern Turkey and northern Syria, of choosing Classical Arabic, an entirely dead language. My folks are thus lucky to pray in a mixture of dead Koine, Church Greek, and no less dead Quranic Arabic. What does this point have to do with a book on randomness? Our human nature dictates a need for the péché mignon. Even the economists, who usually find completely obtrusive ways to escape reality, are starting to understand that what makes us tick is not necessarily the calculating accountant in us. We do not need to be rational and scientific when it comes to the details of our daily life, only in those that can harm us and threaten our survival. Modern life seems to invite us to do the exact opposite, become extremely realistic and intellectual when it comes to such matters as religion and personal behavior, yet as irrational as possible when it comes to matters ruled by randomness, say, portfolio or real estate investments. I have encountered colleagues, rational, no-nonsense people, who do not understand why I cherish the poetry of Baudelaire and Saint-Jean-Perse, or obscure and often impenetrable writers like Elias Canetti, J.L. Borges, or Walter Benjamin. Yet they get sucked into listening to the analyses of a television guru or into buying the stock of a company they know absolutely nothing about, based on tips by neighbors who drive expensive cars. The Vienna Circle, in their dumping on Hegel-style verbiage based on philosophy, explained that, from a scientific standpoint, it was plain garbage, and from an artistic point of view, it was inferior to music. I have to say that I find Baudelaire far more pleasant to frequent than CNN newscasters or listening to George Will. There is a Yiddish saying, "If I am going to be forced to eat pork, it better be of the best kind. If I am going to be fooled by randomness, it better be of the beautiful and harmless kind." This point will be made again in Part 3.